Christmas at the Cove. Heartwarming women's fiction. Five Island Cove, Book 4. Written by Jessie Newton. Narrated by Jill Smith. Chapter 23. Robin stood in her office and looked at the neat piles on her desk. Their house sat on a slope, she'd learned, because only the back of their property had suffered any damage at all. The backyard still had water in it, and while their neighbors had started to pump the standing water out of their yards, Duke and Robin hadn't done anything yet. There wasn't anywhere for the water to go, anyway. They didn't have beachfront property, and all they'd do is pump the water from their yard into someone else's, or onto the street. It wasn't hurting anything at the moment, anyway. The back patio had remnant stains of standing water, but it was gone now. Duke had set up the fans and blown out the moisture in the kitchen and dining room, and only the vinyl near the sliding glass door had peeled up at all. Her husband would fix it, and just as soon as they replaced the carpet in the living room, they'd be back to living normally. Robin's chest pinched, because if Duke didn't get up in the morning and drive the girls to school, then head to the docks and the Lady Hawk, that would not be life as normal. She had no idea what he'd do if he didn't fish, and she lifted her hand to her mouth to chew on her thumbnail. She normally wasn't a nail-biter, but life had thrown a few curveballs this year. Robin turned to the Christmas tree she'd set up in front of the bay window in her office. They'd planned to spend the holidays at home, after their brief time at the Cliffside Inn, and Robin had been wrapping presents and putting them under the tree all month. The cheery red, green, white, and blue packages didn't have to think about the right course of action. In a few days' time, the paper would curl into ribbons of smoke as Duke fed it to their fireplace on the wall opposite from where Robin stood. Darkness had started to fall, and Robin and Duke had opted to come back to the house here on Diamond rather than returning to the inn. Mandy and Jamie said they'd be fine, and Eloise's mother was there. Alice was going back tonight too, and Robin had asked her to check on the girls. Robin sighed as she moved over to the desk and sat down. She couldn't recall ever being this mentally tired. When she'd been pregnant with Jamie, she'd hardly been able to sleep for the last month before she'd come. She'd been so tired then, too, but in a different way. I hate not knowing what to do. Robin Grover knew what to do in almost all situations. Her personal convictions usually illuminated a clear path, and all she had to do was employ her bravery to take the first step. She opened the folder for the wedding in just a few days, and she moved the catering post-it from the left side to the right. She pulled off the one labeled band and threw it away. The bride and groom had taken care of that, and Robin didn't need to follow up with it. She moved a couple more notes, including the ones for the flowers and the e-invites, and surveyed the two that were left. She needed to get down to the venue and see for herself what she'd be dealing with. Judy, the event coordinator for the beachside wedding hall, had sent pictures, but Robin suspected things changed on an hourly basis. While she had the venue booked and confirmed after the tsunami, she didn't move it to the right side of the folder. The last post-it never got moved from the to-do side to the done one until the morning of the event. Decor. Robin always had a separate list for decor as well, and she checked it to make sure she had everything waiting in the bins near the entrance of the office. She got up to go through them again, because it would give her hands and mind something to do, when Duke appeared in the doorway.
"What are you thinking?"
he asked, leaning against the doorway and folding his arms. Robin drank in his dark features that had always called to her female side. He'd started to get some silver among the brown and black, and she liked that a whole lot too. "I don't know," she said. "It's Diane Proctor." Those words didn't mean the same thing to him as they did to Robin, and she wasn't sure how to explain. Aaron and Eloise had left the pavilion without listening to the pitch. After AJ and Matt had gone, Eloise had said everyone should do what they thought best, but that she didn't want any part of Diane Proctor's money, and that she believed taking it would put a wedge between her and AJ she didn't want. Robin didn't want that either. She simply hadn't been able to walk away. Alice and Kristen had stayed as well. Laurel and Paul had left, as they didn't have a nomination in play anyway. Robin suspected they'd come as support to Aaron and to offer a second opinion after the pitch. Will Bridge had stayed, never more than a few feet from Alice. Kelly had stuck close to Alice as well, and Robin had never felt more isolated from her friends. She was used to being the center, the one who brought them all together, the one who they asked for advice. I feel like maybe I'm not thinking clearly because I want the boat so badly, she said. I feel like Eloise is right. If we accept the help, there will always be this invisible wedge between me and everyone else. Duke nodded, his jaw set. His eyes were dark and harbored some anger, but also acceptance.
I know how important your friends are to you.
But how important should they be? She asked, desperate for him to tell her what to do. The decision here was hers, they both knew it. He wanted to accept the money and get a new boat. Robin wanted that too. She simply thought there was a price to receive it, and she wasn't sure if she could pay it. No matter how I look at it, we end up in debt, she said. One is monetary and our own. We go get a loan for a new boat. We pay it off. The other is a debt all the same, to Diane Proctor. One I have no doubt she'll call on us to repay at some point in the future when it suits her needs. Robin had listened to the pitch, and everything sounded far too good to be real and true. A new fishing boat, free and clear. Paperwork to be signed, of course. Alice had taken hers and said she'd go over all of it and let everyone know what they were really signing.
Heard from Alice?
Duke asked, as if the question had been summoned by Robin's thoughts. She shook her head and bent to open the box she needed to go through. I don't want to decide myself.
What kind of debt could Diane Proctor call in?
That's just it, Robin said. Who knows? She pulled out a box of mini fish bowls. She'd fill them with sand when she arrived at the venue and put flowers in them for the decor on the altar. She's not a nice person, Duke. She left AJ and her siblings without a word. She hasn't called, texted, sent cards, nothing in 35 years. Robin couldn't imagine what kind of person could do that, let alone a mother. The woman she'd seen that afternoon barely looked a week older than AJ herself, and Robin supposed she'd needed something more fulfilling than motherhood in her life. Robin didn't understand that on a fundamental level. Being Mandy and Jamie's mother was the single most fulfilling thing she did with her day. She'd organized and planned over 100 weddings. They didn't matter to her nearly as much as making sure her daughters knew they were loved, that they had dinner, that they had someone to talk to after school if they needed it.
I'll do what you want,
Duke said. I know that, Robin said, but you're putting a ton of pressure on me, Duke. She tossed him a disgruntled look, though she didn't want to fight with him. It wasn't his fault. This situation was impossible. I know what you want me to do. I know what Eloise and Alice and AJ want me to do. I feel like no matter what I decide, I'm going to have someone upset with me. She just needed to decide which was the lesser of the two evils. Duke would forgive her eventually. Would her friends? Then there was the question of whether her friendships were so important that she'd choose them over her own husband's needs, her own family's needs, even over herself. And added to that was the complication that the money would be coming directly from AJ's mother. Robin felt certain that she'd be climbing straight into bed with the devil if she did that, and not only would she lose AJ, she'd lose her soul too. She shook her head when Duke remained silent. I think we need to explore every avenue to replace your boat, she said quietly, her hands stilling after she set the fish bowls on her desk. Not take the first one that comes along because it seems easy.
It seems too easy,
Duke said. Yes, Robin agreed, turning to step into his arms. He uncrossed his arms easily, though he didn't smile. He didn't kiss her neck the way he usually did. He just held her against his chest and they breathed in and out.
Can we get alone?
He asked in a whisper. We'll have to see, Robin said. I think there are probably going to be plenty of banks and credit unions helping people in the cove right now. Duke did dip his head and sweep his lips along her ear.
So what do you want to do?
She knew every day he couldn't go out on the water was a day of lost income. Am I selfish if I ask for more time?
Let's call Margie in the morning.
He said.
Am I selfish if I ask you to come to bed with me right now?
He pressed his mouth to her neck.
The girls are gone, and it's never just us.
Robin leaned her head back as an answer, and Duke took what he wanted from the delicate skin there. He pressed into her and said,
Are we still going back to Sanctuary in the morning?
I don't know, Robin whispered. After the meeting in the pavilion had ended, the group had disbanded without hardly a word to one another. They were supposed to meet at the inn for breakfast. It was Eloise's contribution to their holiday activities. Robin pulled her phone from her pocket as Duke's mouth dropped even lower. Eloise hasn't texted, she said, pulling in a breath as his lips found her collarbone. No one had texted. Duke said, his hand sliding up under her shirt. I'll find out after, Robin said, lacing her fingers through his hair and adding, I love you, Duke.
Love you too, baby,
he said, claiming her mouth now. Robin managed to focus on her husband and her relationship with him for a while. She lay in his arms and listened to the strong beat of his heart, the steady rise and fall of his chest so comforting to her. After a long time, she rolled over and picked up her phone. No one had texted yet, and Robin hesitated to be the first. Maybe it was time for someone else to play the role of the mother hen, the one who initiated the get-togethers, the Wednesday lunches, the activities. So she put her phone down and rolled back to Duke's side. Chapter 24. Kelly smoothed back her son's hair and smiled at her mother as she put a bowl of chicken noodle soup in front of Parker. There you go, sweetie, she said, bending over to place a kiss on the boy's head. You sure you don't want anything, Cal? Her mother met her eyes with concern in hers, and Kelly shook her head. Devin, her mother's boyfriend, sat on the couch in the nearby living room, and Kelly sure did like him. She wondered when they'd get married, but now didn't feel like the time to ask. You have nothing? Her mom asked. Kelly shook her head. We have a few sets of clothes, she said. The cottage is soaked from floor to ceiling, and I was renting the furniture anyway. The sense of helplessness and defeat hung around Kelly's neck like a noose. She hadn't told her mother about the phone call and offer to get her into another house without any cost to her. Kelly already knew she wouldn't be taking the offer. She'd heard AJ's voice and seen her face when she'd spoken to her mother, and Kelly would rather forfeit her own life than hurt AJ. She'd stayed for the meeting because she hadn't had the courage to leave alone, and everyone else had seemed like they were staying. You didn't have much damage, Kelly said, taking a seat at the table while Parker ate. Her mother bustled around the kitchen. I lost a few trees in the backyard, she said. Honestly, I think they took the brunt of the waves. I also upgraded the house for severe storms a couple of years ago. She joined Kelly and Parker at the table, a couple of plates of pie with her, despite Kelly's denial of it already. Mr. Highway next door didn't do it when the guy came through town, and his place is in a lot worse shape than mine. She lifted her coffee mug to her lips and took a sip. Kelly gave her mom a smile and actually picked up a fork. She'd just taken a bite of the blueberry pie her mom bought from another neighbor down the street when her mom said, You can stay here if you'd like, Kelly. You're always welcome. Thanks, Mom, she said. I think just for tonight. Tomorrow I might want to leave Parker so I can figure out somewhere for us to live. She didn't say so, but she really wanted to find a place in a single day so she and Parker would have somewhere for Christmas Eve. The boy had turned 9 recently, but he still believed in Santa Claus. Kelly thought of the gifts that had washed away with the waves that had come through the cove, and her throat tightened. She wouldn't have time to replace them anyway, and perhaps she could just put her head down and cry. No, she told herself. She wasn't going to let life steamroll her. She thought of the woman who'd broken a window and driven a 9-passenger van all over Sanctuary Island. She needed her to make an appearance and find an apartment and a few gifts. Of course, her mom said. I have to work in the morning, but Devin can take him. Their eyes met, and Kelly hesitated. She liked Devin, and Parker did too, but she'd never left her son with someone like him before. She found herself nodding because she was in a unique situation, and that meant she had to do things outside her sphere of normal. "I'll be gone all day, I'm sure," she said. "I have to find a place to live." Her thoughts went straight to the house on Seabreeze shore, and she knew she could live there. For some reason, she'd been thinking of it as a last resort. The house wasn't ready to be lived in yet, but it had weathered the storm well, too. The house sat up on the cliffs, and there had definitely been water up in the yard. The patio had shown evidence of moss, but the house itself was undamaged and dry. Perhaps tomorrow she should focus on finding a few gifts for Parker, and they could have their own Christmas in the house where she'd grown up. Kelly immediately balked at that idea, and she wasn't sure why. It was time to move forward, move on. She couldn't keep holding on to a piece of the past without using it. Her hand was simply growing sore, and she wasn't doing anything constructive. "Let's call my friend Dixie," Kelly's mother said. "She knows everything about the real estate market in the Cove." She actually picked up her phone to make the call. She looked at Kelly with her light eyes, and Kelly looked into her mom's gaze. So much of herself was found there, and Kelly smiled. "Thanks, Mom." She leaned over and hugged her mom. "Call her. I need a rental, though. I can't afford to buy right now." "Dixie always thinks people should buy," her mom said. "Fair warning." Kelly was getting better and better about putting her foot down, and she'd just tell Dixie Dutton that she wasn't going to buy. Plain and simple. "Dixie," her mom said, "it's Paula Watkins. My daughter lost her rental home in the tsunami. What have you got with 2 bedrooms, decently furnished for a good price?" Dixie obviously started talking, and Kelly's mother gestured for her to get something to write with. "Oh, is that right?" She pulled the phone from her ear and tapped the speaker button. Dixie's voice came through the line mid-sentence. "Show her in the morning if she's willing to commute." Kelly nodded because she'd literally spent her life commuting from the outer islands to Diamond. She and Parker made the journey each morning, though the ride from Sanctuary was easy at only 17 or 18 minutes. "Yes," Kelly said, finding her voice. "I'm willing to commute, ma'am." "Kelly," Dixie said, her voice filled with warmth and smiles. "It's so good to hear from you." "I missed most of what you said," she said. "Can you say it again?" "Sure," Dixie said. "I told your mother I've got a client who called this morning to say they're going back to the mainland tomorrow, quite last minute. His mother apparently fell, and he's going to spend some time with her. A few months at least, he said." Dixie spoke so fast, and Kelly didn't even try to type any notes into her phone. "He works from home, so he's here sometimes and in Maryland sometimes. His place is nice, and he asked me to sublet the apartment if I could. It's fully furnished, and he'll have a cleaning service go through it tomorrow, so it likely won't be ready until the day after, so just in time for Christmas." Kelly pressed her eyes closed, feeling the stars line up just for her. "How much?" Kelly asked, her voice barely making it out of her mouth. "He's quite reasonable," Dixie said. "I haven't even listed it yet because, well, there's so much going on right now." "If I can afford it, I'll take it," Kelly said. "You won't need to list it." "It's $950 usually," Dixie said. "But like I said, David isn't particularly fussy about it. He owns it, so he's not trying to pay a mortgage or anything. Last time it took me a few months to even rent it at that price. What can you afford? I'll just tell him that I had to list it for lower to get a renter in quickly." Kelly had been paying $800 for the beach bungalow, and it had a prime location and a short commute. "What island is it on?" she asked. "How far is the commute to Diamond?" "It's on Belle," Dixie said. "The direct ferry to Diamond takes 30 minutes. The house is a twin home, and the neighbor next door is quiet as a mouse. It's a 5-minute walk to the ferry, too, so you don't need a car, and you won't have rideshare fares." "I can afford $800, Kelly said, opening her eyes and looking at her mother. She wore apprehension in her gaze, but she nodded. "I'm available in the morning to see it." "Perfect," Dixie said. "Give me a second." Silence poured through the line, and Kelly's heart started pounding like a drum. "About 9?" Dixie asked. "I can take you there before I catch the ferry to Pearl for another showing at 10. "Oh, do you live on Belle?" "Yes," Dixie said. "It's the best island in the Cove." She wore plenty of pride in her voice now. "See you at 9. "Yes," Kelly said, and she tapped the red phone icon to end the call. She exhaled, a smile slowly spreading across her whole face. Mom, I can't even believe that just happened. She picked up her fork again and took a much bigger bite of pie. I'll take Parker with me to look at the house, but then I'll need to go take care of a few things on Sanctuary. Can Devin still take him?
I can.
Devin said, coming into the kitchen.
We can go mini-golfing.
It's winter, dear, Kelly's mother said with a smile at her boyfriend as he leaned down and touched his lips to her forehead. Kelly has hopefully found a place to live, but she and Parker are going to be here tonight.
Sounds good.
He gave Kelly a kind smile, and she returned it. She hoped that when she found another man to love, that he would be a lot like Devin. Kind, handsome, and devoted to making sure she was blissfully happy. Kelly ate a whole piece of pie before she announced she was going to go take a bath and get ready for bed. In the bathroom, with the door closed and locked, she texted AJ, "Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm staying with Amy for a bit," AJ said. "You?" "I'm at my mother's." Sheer gratitude came over Kelly that she could go to her mother when she needed her. "Glad you went to see Amy." AJ didn't answer, and Kelly suspected she didn't know how to explain her aversion to visiting Belle Island whenever she came to the Cove. Kelly didn't normally push anyone, least of all AJ. This time she sent another text. "Are you going to see your dad?" "I am," AJ said. "It's time, and I don't know what I have to hide anymore." Kelly nodded to herself, sitting right there in her mother's house on the closed toilet. "I'm not going to take the money from White Sands Worldwide," Kelly said out loud to herself as she typed out the message. She inhaled for a long few seconds as the message spun and sent. Her phone rang, and AJ's name sat there. "Hey," Kelly said. "You stayed, though, right?" AJ asked. Kelly wasn't sure if she was upset or not. "Yes," Kelly admitted. "Eloise and Aaron left as well. Everyone else stayed." She held her breath, wondering how AJ would take that news. "Everyone has to do what they want," she finally said. "I'm not taking the money," Kelly said. "I think I found a new place to live already, and I wouldn't use your mother no matter what. I know what you've been through because of her." "So does everyone else," AJ said quietly. Kelly didn't want to disagree with her, so she said nothing. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle of what AJ thought was true. Kelly knew a lot of what AJ had endured as a teen because they'd ridden the ferry together to school each day. Alice, Eloise, and Robin didn't. They only knew what AJ said to them. And for the last year or so before they'd left the Cove for college, AJ had distanced herself from everyone, even Kelly a little bit. "It's on Belle," Kelly said. "The apartment. I'm meeting the realtor at 9 in the morning. If you'd like, I'll go to your dad's with you afterward." "Would you?" AJ asked. "You're not going to the inn for breakfast?" "Are we still doing that?" Kelly asked. "We're not? You're going to go?" Kelly was aware they were both asking questions and not answering any. "I wasn't planning to go," AJ said. "I wish I was a forgiving person, Kel, but I'm not. I haven't forgiven my mother for leaving, and I'm not sure I'd be able to look Robin or Kristen in the face, knowing they chose her over me." Kelly wanted to say it wasn't so black and white. Of course Robin wouldn't be choosing AJ's mother over AJ, but it was good to know how AJ viewed the situation. "No one said what they'd do," Kelly said. "It was weird, actually. You left, and Eloise chastised all of us, and she and Aaron left, too. Paul and Laurel went with them, and then your mom—" She cut off because maybe AJ didn't want to know. Kelly cleared her throat. "We got the information, and then we all just sort of left, without saying anything to anyone." AJ didn't say anything, and Kelly cleared her throat again. "I'm glad you're okay." "I'm glad you are," AJ said. They said their goodbyes, and Kelly stared at her phone until it darkened. Someone needed to ask about breakfast in the morning, but Kelly didn't know what to say. "You should at least tell Elle you can't come," she said. She started typing, deciding to keep the message short and sweet. Chapter 25. Laurel rode in the passenger seat of Paul's police car, her heart starting to pound as he made one last turn onto her lane. She'd seen so much damage already. Power poles down, and trampolines in a tangled mess of metal legs. There had been water way up on the beaches just down from Paul's house, and he had standing water in his front yard. "This doesn't look bad," Julie, his sister, said from the back seat. "Your house is on a higher street, Laurel." Laurel didn't quite know what to say. Julie was a couple of years younger than Paul, and that made her a couple of years older than Laurel. She did mother Paul a little bit, as their mother had died several years ago. Julie was married with 3 kids, and honestly, she reminded Laurel a lot of Robin. Robin mixed with Alice, which made her smile, because it felt like Robin and Alice hardly got along. They were both strong women, though, and Laurel liked them each in different ways. "Screen door is off," Paul said as he pulled up to Laurel's house. She normally loved coming home to her pale yellow Rambler, the bright blue shutters and front door such a contrast to the mellower paint on the house. She'd done all the painting herself during one of her reinvention periods. She'd learned how to write screenplays once upon a time, too, and she'd grown all of her own herbs for a year. Laurel couldn't stand to sit still for very long, and she liked to keep her mind and hands busy with new things. She'd never been cross-country skiing, and it was definitely on her bucket list. If she couldn't leave the house every single day, she'd probably go mad by dinner time. She got out of the cruiser and looked toward the house. The screen door was bent sideways on the hinges, and as Paul came around the car, he said, "I can fix it, Laurel." "Thank you," she said, reaching for his hand and feeling more centered and like herself as his fingers wrapped around hers. "It doesn't look like the water went too high." That was one good thing about water. It left marks. It wasn't hard to see where it had gotten to, either, and the line on her house sat just below her front windows. It had definitely crested the bottom of the front door, and Laurel wondered if it had seeped inside. If so, she'd have wet carpet and linoleum, and the feet of her furniture would likely be soggy, too. She took the first step up the sidewalk, noting that her rose bushes looked much worse than they had when she'd gone to work on Saturday morning. They likely wouldn't come back in the spring, and Laurel loved roses so much she'd go get new ones to plant. The rose bushes represented a time of new growth for her. They were one of the first plants she'd put in the yard of this new house, the first she'd bought on her own, and the first place she'd lived after she'd finally ended everything with her abusive ex-husband. She glanced at Paul, as she hadn't quite told him about Owen yet. The first and only time she'd mentioned him, she'd called him a boyfriend. In her mind, that was all Owen had ever been, but she knew the state of Massachusetts would show something different. Owen had forced her to marry him, and she'd had to pay to file for the divorce, show up in court, and deal with all of it. At least Owen hadn't come to contest anything. She'd assumed he'd found someone else to terrorize, and she'd seriously considered pressing charges against him for something, simply to protect anyone else he might meet in the future. She'd met with Deputy Chief Charles, and they'd gone over all of Laurel's complaints. Owen hadn't kept her confined to their home. He had forced himself on her sexually, but they were married, and the deputy chief had said it would be a very hard case to prove, and even harder to win. In the end, she'd done nothing, and Owen had left the cove. Laurel had started the healing process. It had been a long 4 years, and she'd lovingly clipped roses every spring and all summer as a reminder that she could bloom again, year after year, tragedy after tragedy. She climbed the steps first and keyed in the code to unlock the door. The satisfying whir of the deadbolt and resulting click met her ears, and she turned the knob. "At least I don't have pets," she said, looking over her shoulder to Paul. She wanted to share more of her life with him. He'd been nothing but kind and patient with her. She'd run to him after Eloise had found her and Aaron in the chief's car together, but that situation had been explained and handled. Laurel hadn't been intimate with Paul yet, and he hadn't brought it up either. The very idea still had her stomach in knots, though she enjoyed kissing Paul and cuddling with Paul and being with Paul. The scent of something salty and stale met her nose, and Laurel turned away. "It's wet," she said. Not only that, but a distinct breeze blew through the house now that the front door stood open, and that meant there was something ajar or broken at the back of the house. "I guess I have shoes on," she said, taking the first step into the house. Paul followed, with his sister right behind him. She flipped a light switch, and the light came on. The bulb popped in the next moment, and Laurel flinched away from the cracking sound and the resulting darkness, while Julie yelped. They'd left the pavilion an hour ago, and darkness was definitely starting to settle over the island. They'd first gone to Paul's, where his sister had been staying with him for the holidays. Julie and Paul were close, and she'd been putting her husband and kids to work around Paul's house to get it back to a fully functioning dwelling. They'd gone there first, and sure enough, Julie and her family had been working hard. Paul's house had looked great, and Laurel supposed she could stay with him. Her sister had texted to say her house had some damage, and she'd be staying with her boyfriend. Laurel wondered if they'd have an extra bed for her, too. She walked behind the couch positioned perpendicular to the front door. Her goal, the next light switch on the next corner. This time, the bulb stayed on, flooding the kitchen, dining room, and living room with warm, yellow light. "The window above the sink is broken," she said, a chill moving down her arms despite the jacket she wore. Paul stepped right behind her, his eyes sweeping everything, too. Laurel wanted nothing more than a hot shower, some fresh clothes, and a cup of hot broth. She and Paul had been wearing the same clothes for days, and while it worked for him because he was tall, silver, and sexy, she desperately needed some time to freshen up.
"I don't think you're staying here tonight, Laurel,"
he said quietly. "I'll text Lyle and tell him to get another bed ready," Julie said. She turned around and retraced her steps. "It's freezing in here. I'm going to go wait in the car." She closed the front door behind her, and neither Paul nor Laurel moved. "I want to make coffee in my own pot," she said. Laurel wasn't much of a traveler, and she liked being home more than anywhere else. "I want to shower in my own bathroom, with my own soaps and oils."
"I know, sweetie."
Paul put his arm around her waist, and Laurel leaned into his strength.
"I think it's too late for the ferry back to Sanctuary, though I'm sure Eloise would let you stay there for a while."
Laurel shook her head. The past few days with Eloise Hall had been really good for Laurel, as all of the awkwardness between them had dissipated quickly as they'd banded together to help others. "Eloise said the inn is full starting on Christmas Eve. I can't ask her to give up a room someone has paid for."
"There's a room at my place,"
he said, as if he knew Laurel was thinking about calling for a hotel. The problem was they were full too, as many people around the cove were dealing with the exact same situation Laurel now found herself in. "There's really not," she said. "Besides, you and Julie have family traditions for Christmas, and I don't know." She finally tore her eyes from the broken window and the flapping curtains to face Paul. He looked at her with those bright brown eyes, his beard grown out and oh so sexy. "I feel like I'm crashing your family Christmas."
"Laurel."
He didn't say anything else, but his eyes searched hers for several long moments. "Paul," she said, deciding she might as well lay everything on the line. "Remember what I told you about my ex-boyfriend?"
"You've not said much, actually."
She nodded, a lump forming in her chest that made it hard to speak now, too. "He wasn't my boyfriend. He brought a preacher to the house and forced me to marry him. Technically, he was my husband." Paul's eyes widened, and they searched more earnestly.
"Laurel, I have no idea what to say."
"I don't have any kids," she said. "I'm not whole in a lot of ways, Paul. That's why I can't. I want to be with you, but I understand if you'd prefer to be with someone who's ready to move a little faster than I currently can."
"No,"
he said, shaking his head.
"I'm not looking for someone to sleep with. I mean,"
he ducked his head.
"Of course I want to sleep with you. I'm a man after all, and you're an incredibly beautiful, talented, smart woman."
He was whispering by the end of the sentence. Laurel took his face in both of her hands and lifted his chin so they could look at one another.
"I'm not just looking for someone to sleep with,"
he said.
If I wanted that, Laurel, I'm sure I could find someone.
She was sure he could too, which was why she'd said what she had. I don't want to slow you down,
You're not.
he said.
Laurel, I know we haven't said many serious things yet, but I like you very much.
He smiled and pressed into one of her palms.
I'm enjoying getting to know you, and I want to be with you. Just you.
Laurel smiled up at him, tipped up, and touched her mouth to his. This kiss wasn't anywhere near as passionate as some of their others, but it said much, much more. It was far more intimate, and Laurel enjoyed the way his mouth trembled against hers in such a sweet, vulnerable way. She didn't get to see Paul like this very often, as he was an alpha male officer on Chief Sherman's force. He was the assistant chief. He'd achieve the rank of captain soon, if Laurel knew anything about how the chief worked, and she did. He pulled away and touched his forehead to hers.
Okay, Laurel?
Okay, Paul. She breathed in the musty and musky scent of him, as they'd both been using perfumes and colognes to cover up their days-old clothing. I like you a whole lot, too, so you know. She pulled away and stuck her hands in her pockets. Julie's right. We can't stand around in here. I'm going to go get some clothes, and I'll meet you back in the car. Paul nodded.
Are you going to stay with me or find a hotel?
Laurel tore right down the middle. I don't want to sleep on an air mattress.
I have a king-size bed,
Paul said.
Nothing you don't want to do, Laurel.
I told you that once, and I meant it. Laurel's eyes rounded, and she was the one searching his face now. He'd never lied to her, though, and she had no reason to distrust him now either. Give me 5 minutes, she said, turning away from him. She hurried down the hall to her bedroom and pulled a bag from the top of her closet. The bed skirt had definitely been wet, as it showed a salty crustiness that only came from ocean water. The carpet here seemed dry, though, but Laurel knew she'd have to rip it out and replace it. She didn't have money for any of that, at least not on a house-wide scale. One step at a time, she muttered to herself, thinking of the last 4 years of her life. She'd made it through them one step at a time. She thought of her relationship with Paul. They were making things work one step at a time. If she stayed in his bed with him that night, that would be a huge step in her mind, and she honestly didn't know if she was ready to take it. She knew how to pack jeans, sweaters, socks, and shoes. She added several uniform pieces, as she didn't have the next few weeks off of work. She and Connor should be back out on duty tomorrow, in fact. She needed to check the schedule and see what Gina and the chief had been working on. Her thoughts went to Chief Sherman and Eloise, and the brave way they'd stood up to their friends. They did what was right, according to what they believed, and Laurel wanted to do the same. She gathered her personal toiletries, thankful for her own brand of shampoo and conditioner, and started down the hall again. She'd have to call and get someone to come install a new window. She could rip out old carpet and get the subfloor drying herself. Paul could fix the screen door, and she could start to replace the flooring throughout the house. She could run a load of sheets and towels and anything else necessary through the washing machine, and she could get fans to dry the legs and feet of her couches and chairs. The tsunami had caused a setback in Laurel's life, but it was not a roadblock she couldn't get around. She skipped down the steps and practically ran down the sidewalk toward Paul's cruiser. He waited next to her door, a handsome smile on his face that made her blood run hotter.
Got everything?
He asked, reaching for her bag. She handed it to him, and he started toward the trunk. Yes, she said. Enough for now, anyway. Paul, I'll stay with you. He swung back toward her, surprise etched in every line of his face. Laurel shook her head as she giggled. Don't look like that. I've stayed over before.
In the guest room,
he said. You held me while I slept.
Can I do that tonight?
He turned away and lifted the trunk, which had already been opened.
Hold you while you sleep?
Laurel watched him lift her bag inside his trunk and close it. Their eyes met from several feet apart, and she asked, What will your sister think of us sleeping in the same room?
I'll just kindly remind her that I'm 40 years old,
he said,
And you're a consenting adult, and what we do behind closed doors in my home is entirely up to us."
Laurel grinned at him. "I so want to be there when you say that to her." He laughed and shook his head.
"I thought you liked Julie."
"I do," Laurel said. "I like her a lot. But Paul, come on. You have to admit she's like your mother, who I do not think would approve of us sharing a bed, even if there's nothing going on but sleeping."
Paul took her into his arms again. "I wish you could have met my mother. I think you'd be surprised. She wasn't as traditional as you might think."
"Then why did Julie tell her husband to set up another bed for me?"
"She probably doesn't want me to get hurt," Paul said. "You're not the only one with a crazy ex in her past."
Laurel looked up at him, shock cascading through her whole body. "You've said nothing."
"Like I said,"
he said,
"we haven't talked about a lot of serious things yet."
"Maybe we should."
"We will,"
he promised as he reached to open her door for her. She slid into the passenger seat and buckled while Paul went around the vehicle and got behind the wheel.
"Jules," he said, "tell Lyle we don't need another bed. Laurel's going to stay with me."
In the rearview mirror, Laurel watched her facial expression changed, and she had a very hard time suppressing her giggle.
"I'm 40 years old," Paul said, grinning at Laurel. "It's my house, and what Laurel and I do behind closed and locked doors is none of your business."
Julie opened her mouth and a squeak came out. Paul started the car as he started to laugh.
"There you go, Laurel."
She reached across the console and all the equipment and squeezed Paul's hand. They hadn't reached the end of the block when Julie said, "I just texted Lyle."
"Great,"
Paul practically bellowed. "As long as the door is locked, Paul," Julie said next. "You have 3 nieces and nephews who love to come see you first thing in the morning."
"Oh, it'll be locked,"
Paul said, grinning at Laurel again. She smiled back, but the moment had lost some of its humor. She watched out the window at the piles of debris alongside the road until it was too dark to see them anymore, her thoughts revolving around her sleeping arrangements that evening. Her phone chimed, and she released Paul's hand to check it. Kelly had texted the group with, "I have to go see an apartment in the morning at 9, so I won't be able to make the breakfast. I'm sorry, Eloise. I then need to find some quick presents for Parker, as all of ours washed away or got ruined. Anyone up for shopping about 11? No one had responded yet, and the need for Laurel to do so pressed against her heartbeat. She didn't know what to say, though, because she'd never planned on attending the breakfast at the inn tomorrow morning. She should be working, and she started tapping to get to the station spreadsheet that would confirm if she was on duty or not. Chapter 26. Eloise read Kelly's text nearly the moment it came in. She sat at the dinner table with Billy, Grace, and Aaron, the 4 of them sipping the organic tomato soup she'd warmed and eating crispy, buttery grilled cheese sandwiches. Eloise hadn't been able to eat much, and she'd said even less. Aaron wasn't particularly chatty that night, and even Grace had stopped talking about her class, the gift exchange, her ice cream, and what she hoped Santa would bring for her in just a couple of days. "Dad?" Billy asked, looking up from her phone. Aaron and Eloise were so off their games, everyone had a device at the dinner table with them, and Eloise looked away from Kelly's message that said she wouldn't be at the inn for the group breakfast in the morning. She honestly expected everyone else to drop out too, and her heart felt like it physically plummeted into her feet. "There's a holiday party tomorrow," she said. "Kim has these tennis courts at her house, and her dad turns them into an ice skating rink in the winter." She glanced at Eloise. "Could I go? Addie is going to be there, and Kara."
"Who else?"
"Kim's a year older than us." Billy shot a glance at Eloise. "She also has an older brother, and he's invited some friends. I don't know everyone who will be there." Aaron looked at Eloise, too, and she gave an almost imperceptible shrug of her shoulders.
"I thought we were spending the day at the inn tomorrow,"
he said.
"Elle is hosting the holiday breakfast, and we have the big concluding dinner in the evening. What time is the party?"
"It's in the afternoon," Billy said as Eloise started shaking her head.
"No?" Aaron asked.
"I don't know about what's happening tomorrow," Eloise said, pure misery in her words. "Callie just texted to say she can't come in the morning, and
I don't know. She picked up her sandwich and took a bite, but the bread, butter, and cheese didn't taste nearly as good as it usually did.
I can ride the ferry myself, Billy said. I'll be back in time for dinner.
Everyone else will come, though,
Aaron said.
Kelly's in a unique situation because she needs an entirely new place to live.
Eloise's phone chimed again, and then again, but she didn't have the heart to look at it.
If she'd made everyone put their phones in the basket like she normally did so they could enjoy a family dinner together, she wouldn't even know she'd gotten new messages. I don't want you riding the ferry alone, Bills,
Aaron said while Eloise chewed and swallowed.
She'd never experienced a sandwich that tasted so much like sawdust before, and she knew it had everything to do with her mood and nothing to do with Aaron's cooking.
I'm old enough to ride the ferry, Billy said. Lexi does it every single day for school.
There are monitors on the ferries just for students, Aaron argued back. School's not in session right now, and there would be no one there to keep an eye on you.
I don't need anyone to keep an eye on me. Billy looked at Eloise. Kelly puts Parker on the ferry alone sometimes.
Eloise couldn't argue with that, and she'd learned to simply let Aaron and Billy go back and forth a little bit. She didn't need to be the peacemaker between them. And honestly, that felt like an impossible task anyway. She picked up her phone to see that Alice had texted, but not in the group string. Robin, too, also privately, just to Eloise.
My children are at the inn, so I'll be there,
Alice had said.
If you don't want to have the breakfast, I understand. Perhaps you and I could go out with your mother and the twins. Duke and I are going to the bank in the morning to explore our options,
Robin had said, which caused Eloise's heart to lift and leap in a new way. If Robin didn't take the money from White Sands Worldwide, Eloise couldn't imagine anyone else would. She'd already made her decision, and her stomach writhed with the way she'd lectured everyone else. That was not something Eloise normally did. She respected the differences in people, and she normally allowed everyone to make their own decisions without giving them her opinion, especially when they hadn't asked for it. She'd been toying with sending an apology for hours, but once she and Aaron had arrived here, they'd been working to clear away any debris that would threaten the structural integrity of the house, sweep the water out of the garage, and mop up the little bit that had come in through the sliding glass door. Other than that, Aaron's house hadn't suffered too much damage, and Eloise had thumbed her way through an article in the Cove Chronicles about how the most damage had actually been on Rocky Ridge and Sanctuary Island, due to the rockiness of those islands. They'd had landslides and cliffs cleave off into the ocean due to the impact of the waves. Diamond, Pearl, and Belle had suffered from flooding, but not much else. Boats, of course, were now toothpicks, and Eloise's mind wandered to Robin and Duke once more. If it's okay with Eloise, Aaron said, and Eloise looked up from her phone. If she's having the dinner, we've committed to that, and you'll need to be there. Family comes before friends. He nodded at Eloise, and she looked from him to Billy.
I already said I'd be back in time for the dinner, Billy said, her bright eyes pleading with Eloise. And if you're doing the breakfast, I won't miss that either. The party is at 2, Eloise.
It's fine with me, she said, another text vibrating against her fingers. Kristen had sent this one, and it read, Is everyone canceling, Eloise? Would it be beneficial to have breakfast here at the lighthouse? No one would have to ride a ferry. Eloise suspected AJ would, and Kelly definitely would need to ride a ferry. She didn't know how to answer anyone, and she didn't want to have a holiday breakfast that was meant for 6 with only 4. 3, she thought, if you're lucky. She, Alice, and Kristen would be the only ones there, and Eloise felt things in her life splintering in a way she detested. Robin didn't normally shy away from hard situations, but she'd been presented with something incredibly difficult, and she'd retreat to her core, Duke, until it was solved. AJ could leave the cove and never return. Eloise had seen her do it before. Kelly just needed some time to catch her breath, and Eloise decided to answer her first. I'm glad you found somewhere to potentially live. I hope the apartment is amazing. She sent that message, already thinking of and then typing another one. Would you come to breakfast if we did it later? We could go shopping together afterward. Yes, Kelly sent back. I just need to find a few things so Christmas isn't completely ruined. Eloise navigated to Alice's text next. Would the twins be willing to bring my mother to the lighthouse for breakfast? Kristen has offered, as most of us are here on Diamond tonight. Thoughts? She sent a similar text to Robin about having a later start time for the breakfast, and her heart pumped extra hard as that one swirled and then sent. Erin got up from the table, and Eloise put her phone down. Sorry, sweetheart, she said. I'm sort of managing a crisis. I can imagine, he said, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. We're fine. I'm going to get the tiny one in the bath, and then we can put a movie on. Eloise nodded, noticing that Billy was not in her spot at the table. Erin went down the hall with Grace while Eloise waited for her friends to text back.
The twins can bring your mother, sure,
Alice said.
Keep me updated. I'm actually at dinner with Will, but I can call you later if that's easier to coordinate something.
Eloise smiled at the thought of Alice on a date, and she'd seen her proper, sophisticated friend with the scruffy, laid-back ferry owner. Have fun, she sent. Robin hadn't answered, and Eloise quickly sent a message to AJ that said, I hope you're okay. I'd love it if you'd let me know you're somewhere safe. Erin and I have room for you here if you need a place. I won't ask you any questions. She wanted to invite her to breakfast in the morning, but she had serious doubts AJ would respond to the text as it was, so she left it at that. Erin returned to the kitchen and picked up Grace's plate. What did I miss with Billy? Eloise asked, shoving her phone in her back pocket. You said she could go to the party, Erin said. She ran down the hall to find the perfect outfit for ice skating. The dishes clacked as he put them in the kitchen sink, a sigh extending past the end of the noise. I worry about her at a party with older boys. As you should. Eloise stood up and took her plate mostly full of food into the kitchen. She threw it away and put her plate on top of the others. She slid her hand along Erin's waist, glad when he lifted his arm over her shoulders. She's a beautiful girl, and she's articulate, fun, and smart. You're not easing my mind, Erin said dryly. Sorry. You said once she wouldn't do anything with a boy, but I'm not so sure. All 7th grade girls like boys, Eloise said with a smile. It's mostly harmless. She turned toward Erin and tucked herself into his chest. Not for boys, Erin murmured. They have hormones they don't understand and can't control. He ran his lips along the curve of her ear, and Eloise shivered in his arms. He brought out the fire in her with a simple touch, and she couldn't wait to be his wife. Kind of like some men I know, she whispered as he committed fully to kissing her neck. He said with a chuckle. It's been a while for us. It has? She asked. It's been 2 nights, Erin. I like listening to you breathe next to me, he whispered, sliding his lips up the length of her throat. When he got near her mouth, Eloise kissed him fully. I like your body, he murmured, his hands wandering down her sides. I like the way you kiss me, and I like the way you touch me, and I like the way you say my name. Wow, Erin, she said, shivering as his hands slid back up her body and into her hair. I'm glad I know a while for you is 2 days, though. He pulled away as he laughed quietly, and Eloise felt the loss of his touch and kiss as keenly as anything she'd ever felt. Do you think you'll ever tire of me? Eloise asked, draping her arms around his neck and looking into those dark eyes. No, he said, as Prince tried to nose his way between the two of them. He pushed the dog away with a smile and the words, Stop it, Prince. I'm kissing my fiancé and you'll have to get used to it. What if you do? Eloise asked, feeling very unsure of so very many things. If her friendships, which she'd thought were so strong, could crumble and fall, why couldn't her marriage and relationship with Erin? It felt so real and seemed so strong to her, but the doubt still lingered in her mind. I'm not going to, Erin said. I love every minute we have together. I love talking to you, and when something good happens, you're the first one I want to tell. If something bad happens, you're still the first one I need to tell, because you'll make things okay. He smiled softly at her, and let his eyes drift closed as he leaned his forehead against Eloise's. They breathed in together, and the moment of comfort and safety between them made Eloise fall in love with him all over again. Plus, I'd make love to you morning, noon, and night if I could, he whispered. I'm tired already, Eloise said with a smile. He pulled back and grinned at her too, the gesture fading quickly. You like making love with me, right? Of course, she said. I'm worried I won't be able to keep up with you. You seem to have an incredible sexual appetite. For you, he said. I have an incredible sexual appetite for you, Eloise Hall. I think you're sexy and smart and articulate, and now you know why I'm so worried about Billy. You should just hope she doesn't ever have a boyfriend who knows how to tell a woman exactly what she needs to hear, kiss her like he's in love with her, and is incredible in bed. Aaron blinked at her and then laughed again. I am in love with you, Elle. He touched his lips to hers in a sweet kiss. I don't just say things. I mean them. He brought her closer, the strength of his muscled body tight and hard against hers. I want to take you to bed right now. You'll have to wait, she whispered, though she did move her fingers up the side of his face and into his hair. He pulled in a breath. See, he said, his voice all air. I like the way you touch me. He leaned into her touch and closed his eyes again. Eloise? Billy called, and Eloise jumped away from the girl's father. Yes, she said, already walking toward the hall. Can you help me with my hair? Billy appeared in the mouth of the hallway, and she only looked at Eloise. Sure, she said. What are you thinking for the party? She followed Billy back to her bedroom, where the girl had a vanity covered with makeup and hair supplies. Is Jake going to be there? Yes, Billy said with guarded eyes. He told Lexi that he likes me, and she started flirting with him like crazy. She rolled those big blue eyes now. Sometimes I don't get her. Well, if he likes you already, surely she won't steal him away? That's exactly what she's trying to do, Billy said. She's good at it, too, because she's pretty and blonde and popular. You're pretty and blonde and popular, Eloise said. Billy scoffed. My hair is practically brown. Some girl in my PE class said it was dirty blonde last week. She reached up and touched her hair. It was dirty blonde, but Eloise loved it. She reached for the brush and started stroking it through Billy's hair. I've always wanted hair this color, Eloise said. Lots of women pay a lot of money to get hair this color. She let a few seconds go by. Billy, you know you're way too young to have a boyfriend, right? I know, Billy said. It's not really a boyfriend, Elle. Her eyes met Eloise's in the mirror on the vanity. It's like he'll hold my hand at parties and everyone will know we're together, but that's about it. No kissing? Billy shrugged. I don't think I'd mind kissing Jake. She grew nervous, if the way she picked up a couple of elastics and started twining them around her fingers was any indication. I've never kissed a boy, Eloise. Is it hard? No, Eloise said slowly. She put the brush down and turned to sit on Billy's bed. The girl twisted in her chair and looked at Eloise, her expression practically begging for more information. I should ask your father before I talk to you about this, Eloise said. No, Billy said. Please don't do that. She got up and closed the door. He won't be mad. He loves you. Eloise ran her hand through her hair and took a calming breath. Billy, I love you. Billy's eyes widened, and then she jumped out of her chair and hugged Eloise. I love you too, Eloise. Eloise pressed her eyes closed and held the girl tightly. I want you to know that, because then you'll know that I'm not trying to make your life harder. She eased back and looked into Billy's eyes. Bills, boys and girls are different. Sex is a wonderful, beautiful thing between two people who love each other. Billy nodded, her eyes wide and round. Like you and my dad. Eloise swallowed, her thoughts down the hall on Aaron and what they did in his bedroom. Yes. She cleared her throat. You know what sex is, right? Yes, Billy said, and she didn't seem embarrassed about that or talking about this. Eloise nodded, her own heart pounding. Sex is normal and natural between two people in a loving, committed relationship. Teenagers usually are incapable of that kind of relationship. So I wouldn't advocate for you to do that with anyone until you're in love with someone who treats you well, respects you, and loves you as much as you love him. Billy just watched Eloise with those sober, wide eyes. Sex isn't dirty, Eloise said. It's just, your dad and I worry about you because you're so pretty and so smart, and teenage boys have hormones they don't understand.
Okay, Billy said. But kissing isn't sex, right?
Eloise smiled and reached out to run her fingers down the side of Billy's face. No, Bills. Kissing is not sex. Jake is a very good-looking boy. I think if you have the chance to kiss him, you should.
What?
Billy blinked rapidly, her smile growing on her face. She so rarely smiled that Eloise grinned back at her. There's just one problem with kissing a boy at your age, Eloise said, retracting her hand and leaning back as she tried to tame her smile. You have to be alone to do it, and Bills, it's not a good idea for you to be alone with a boy.
But is it hard?
No, Eloise said. Kissing is really fun, Bills. It's exciting. You just have to be careful where he puts his hands and be sure to tell him anything he does that you don't like. If he really likes you and he respects you, he won't do those things. She looked down at her hands.
Where do I put my hands?
Usually around his neck, Eloise said, smiling at her, or on his shoulders. She paused for a moment. Billy. The girl looked up. So much fear in her gaze, Eloise almost started laughing. This terrified, almost 14-year-old was who Erin thought was going to sneak off with boys and do things she shouldn't. You'll know what to do when the time comes, Eloise promised. It's not hard, and boys and girls were made to kiss each other. It's natural. Don't think too hard about it. Billy nodded, but she still looked like Eloise had stung her with one of Erin's tasers. Okay, Eloise said, and she took a big breath. What are we doing with your hair? Let's do it so I can go tell your dad what we talked about. As she wove Billy's hair into 2 Dutch braids, she listened to the girl talk about her friends and who she hoped wouldn't come to the ice skating party tomorrow. She talked about Jake and how maybe she could hold his hand on the rink, and that she was going to try to get Daniel to talk to Lexi because Lexi liked him so much, and if they could become a thing, then Lexi would leave Jake alone. Eloise loved listening to Billy and asking questions. She learned all kinds of new terminology, and she couldn't wait to hear how things went at the party. She was also keenly aware of what she didn't hear. Her phone chiming. None of her friends had texted back. Chapter 27. Kristen hadn't heard back from Eloise, and her nerves, stomach, and mind weren't happy about it. She'd felt like this before, and the only way to soothe the ache radiating through her body was to get everyone together and talk. She'd had to do it when AJ and Robin had both been nominated for Homecoming Queen. Something as simple as that had caused a divide between the 5 girls that had concerned Kristen. She'd gotten them all together in the living room of the lighthouse, and she'd forced them to talk. There had been cookies and the guise of passing off a few things in their seafaring booklets. You can't trick them now, she said to herself, the walls of the guest room in the lighthouse closing in on her. The living space here was small, and Kristen was grateful her son and his wife had offered it to her in the first place. They lived on the bottom level, which housed the master suite, living room, and kitchen. This level up from there had 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a larger living area. She got up and left the guest room, padding over to the couch in the living area. She didn't turn on the television or move over to the built-in counter to heat a pot of water for tea. The electric kettle Alice had given her sat there, and Jean had brought all her favorite herbal teas, an assortment of mugs, hot chocolates, and even instant coffee. There had been muffins and pastries, all of which Jean had made herself. She'd been delivering them to the people who lived on this stretch of road that bordered the east side of Diamond Island. Everyone over here had some measure of damage, and while Kristen had been at the Cliffside Inn, Jean and Reuben had been hosting others who'd suffered some home damage. They'd managed to get their roofs fixed and their beds set up again, and they'd gone home. Jean had a big community breakfast planned for tomorrow morning, and they were hosting it in the parking lot here at the lighthouse. Kristen could easily invite her girls, and no one would say a word. She clutched her phone, which had become a lifeline for her since Joel's death, trying to make a decision about what to do. Inhaling, Kristen looked down and started typing. Emergency meeting at the lighthouse at 10:30. Please let me know if you can make it. Jean is serving breakfast for the community in the parking lot. Before she could second-guess herself, she sent the text to her 5 girls. Instantly, guilt hit her. She'd just usurped power over Eloise's planned group breakfast. She wasn't sure if that would comfort Eloise because she didn't have to make a trip to the inn to get the food, or if it would make her feel insignificant and sidelined. She tapped quickly to call Eloise, but the line just rang and rang. She didn't leave a message, and immediately called again. This time, Aaron said, "Kristen, it's Aaron. Elle's down the hall with Billy and the bedroom door is closed. Can I ever call you back?" "Of course," Kristen said, her throat so dry that her voice came out like a croak. "How is she? I'm worried about her." Aaron took a moment to answer. "She's feeling complicated things, as I'm sure most of you are." Kristen nodded, though Aaron wasn't there to see her. "I'm so glad she has you," she said, her voice barely there. "Funny," he said, his tone serious and calm. "I was thinking the same thing about you." A sob gathered in Kristen's throat, and she swallowed hard against it. "I'll have her call you," Aaron said. "I'm not sure what's going on with her and Billy, but she hopefully won't be too much longer." "Thank you." Kristen managed to push through her narrow throat. The call ended, and she knew exactly what she was going to do. Or rather, what she was not going to do. She added another text to the new string that said, "I love you all, and all are welcome at any time. I will not be accepting the offer from White Sands, just so everyone knows, but I will support any decision any of the rest of you make." With that sent, the unrest in Kristen's soul quieted. She leaned back against the couch and sighed, wondering how long it would take for someone to answer, and who would be the first to say they'd either be there or they wouldn't. That first text was always the most important, and Kristen knew it would set the tone for the other responses she'd get. Her phone vibrated against her leg, and she jolted upright to check it. Alice had said,
"I'll be there. And I'm calling Ginny right now to have her bring all the food Eloise bought for us, if that's okay with Al. I will help cook it."
Relief spread through Kristen. Alice was a good first responder, and if she came, Robin would likely come. And if Robin came, Kelly and Eloise would come. And if Kelly came, AJ would too. "I can make 10:30 work," Kelly said. "I might be late, though. I'll stay in touch." AJ didn't answer, and she hadn't messaged on the bigger group thread either, the one with Laurel, Paul, Aaron, Duke, and even the twins. Long minutes passed, and Kristen finally got up and went back into her bedroom. Finally, Eloise called, and Kristen nearly knocked her phone to the ground in her attempts to pick it up. "I'm not going to be offended if we move the breakfast to the lighthouse," she said instead of hello. "I've just spoken to Alice, and she's having the twins bring the food and my mother. We'll all be at the lighthouse by 9 to begin cooking." Kristen silently wept, touched by the goodness of Eloise Hall. "Okay," she managed to say. "Okay," Eloise repeated back to her. "Aaron and the girls are coming too, but he can take them and the teens down to the beach while we have our meeting." "Okay," Kristen said again. Eloise took several moments before she asked, "Did Robin respond to you privately?" "No." "She told me she and Duke are going to a credit union in the morning. I bet she'll come after that." "Okay." "Kristen?" "Yes." "I love you too." Kristen repeated the sentiment back to Eloise, not minding that her voice revealed how she felt. No one else called or texted, and Kristen settled back onto her pillow, her heart healing beat by beat. The following morning, Alice, Charlie, and Ginny arrived first. Charlie had his hand on Dawn Hall's back, and he never moved more than a foot from her. She was a slight, dark-haired woman the teenager could probably pick up and carry just as easily as she hobbled along on her crutches. In fact, one step inside the navy blue door of the lighthouse, and Charlie turned to Dawn. "There's a lot of stairs, Mrs. Hall. Let me carry you." Before she could say a word, Charlie had taken her crutches and handed them to Kristen, who stood on the landing of the steps that led down, and he swept Dawn into his arms. She gave a little shriek, and Charlie asked, "Kristen, we're going down 2 levels or 1? 2, she said, preceding him down the steps. "We'll cook down there, and then we can join Jean for the breakfast in a half an hour." She arrived on the bottom level to find Jean putting 4 more Belgian waffles on a sheet tray in the oven. She slid it back inside and turned with a smile on her face. She was a completely different person than the one who'd come to live in the lighthouse this past summer, and Kristen stepped over and embraced her. "Thanks for letting us crash your breakfast." "It's just fine," Jean said. "I've got all the sausage done and warming. I'm making waffles until 9:30, and Reuben is getting the tables out of the storage right now." Charlie grunted as he set Dawn on the couch, and Alice and Ginny brought up the rear, the 2 of them talking in low voices. Neither of them looked very happy, but Alice painted over her frown with a smile as she arrived in the kitchen and put a large package of pancake mix on the counter. "Good morning, Jean," she said, as if she and Jean were the best of friends and hadn't seen each other for a while. They hugged even, and a moment later, Eloise's voice came down the steps. "Hello?" she called. "We're here." "Come on down," Kristen called up to her, hurrying that way. "Do you need help carrying anything?" Eloise's footsteps came slowly down the steps, carefully, the way Eloise did everything. She arrived with nothing in her hands, and she took Kristen into a tight hug. "Don't stop there," Aaron said from above. "I've got too much milk to slow down." "Sorry." Eloise flattened herself against the wall and let her fiancé by. He grinned at her and then Kristen, carrying 4 gallons of milk as he passed. Billy and Grace arrived last, and they both carried juice and muffins, too. "You didn't have to bring anything," Kristen said, taking the large container of mango pineapple juice from Grace, who looked like she was about to drop it. "The twins couldn't bring everything." Eloise followed Kristen into the small kitchen and living room, said hello to Jean, and started opening cupboards to find a bowl. Plus, I didn't want to impose on Jean's event. "It's fine, Eloise," Jean said. "There's going to be so many waffles." As if Eloise needed proof, Jean opened the double waffle maker and popped out 1 waffle, twisted it, and got out the second. She put them both on the sheet tray in the oven, which probably held another 24 waffles already, and turned back to the second maker on the counter. "I'm going to cut these in half, and I probably have twice as many as I need." "So we can have 2 breakfasts," Aaron said, eyeing the crispy brown waffles. "You already ate breakfast, Daddy," Grace said, and everyone started laughing, even Aaron. "No one eats 3 breakfasts," Eloise said, her smile so pure and so genuine. "I'll run 5 miles every day for a week," he said, reaching for her. "No problem." With all the people, the space felt cramped, but Kristen wouldn't have it any other way. She wanted these people here with her, and she couldn't stop smiling. Jean finished with her waffles, and everyone helped her carry all the food upstairs and out to the parking lot. Reuben had set up tables and chairs, and he was currently visiting with the people who'd already shown up. Jean welcomed everyone, and Kristen stayed while the others went back downstairs to start cooking their own breakfast feast. By 10:30, Kristen's stomach cried for the want of food, but also because no one else had showed up to the lighthouse. Reuben had put a table in the larger living room, and Kristen carried the juice and a plate of blueberry pancakes up to it, while Alice and Eloise brought the bacon and milk. "Well," Kristen said, "I guess it might just be us."
Kelly is coming,
Alice said.
She just texted to say she's 5 minutes out.
I'm surprised Robin isn't here, Eloise said, shooting a worried look at Alice.
She's not going to take the money,
Alice said.
She just needs another plan before she says so.
None of us are taking it, Eloise said, looking from Alice to Kristen. Right? Right, Kristen said. Kelly won't either. So it's just Robin. Eloise sat at the table and ran her hands through her hair.
We're going down to the beach,
Billy said as she appeared in the doorway. Tell me what ferry you're going to be on tonight, Eloise said without getting up. Billy gave her a small smile.
The 542 from Diamond,
she said. Your father will be waiting at the station on Sanctuary, Eloise said.
Yeah,
Billy said.
Probably with his lights on.
She rolled her eyes.
See you later, Eloise.
Bye, sweet girl. Billy left, and the sounds of Grace squabbling with her as they went up to the exit warmed Kristen's heart. She's riding the ferry from here to Sanctuary by herself today, Eloise said. First time.
She'll be fine,
Alice said.
I used to do that all the time. We all did.
Yes, Eloise said. 35 years ago. Alice accepted her point, and Kristen reached for a slice of bacon. Just then, footsteps sounded on the steps, and Kelly came into the room. Good morning, she said, and she wore such light and happiness around her person.
It looks like it is for you,
Alice said. Yes. Kelly grinned as she set her purse on the side counter and joined everyone at the table. I looked at a twin home today, and it's gorgeous. Huge windows, and up on a hill that overlooks the ocean. She sighed. It has 2 bedrooms, and it's furnished, and it has the most beautiful little patio in the back. She grinned around at everyone. I'm getting the contract today, and Parker and I can move in tomorrow. Tears filled her eyes then. If I can get a few presents today, I might be able to give my son a decent Christmas. Kristen reached over and took Kelly's hand in hers. I'm so glad, Kelly. She nodded and brushed her tears away with her other hand, while the others expressed their congratulations as well. A quick beat of silence filled the room before Alice said,
I had an amazing date with Will Bridge last night.
She sighed too, and her happiness permeated the room. Do tell, Eloise said, propping her head in her hands.
Not much to tell,
Alice said.
After the meeting, he called for Italian food. We picked it up and ate it at his house, which I should say rivals my vacation home on Rocky Ridge.
He's rich, Eloise said, grinning. She looked at everyone else. Of course he's rich.
That's not why I like him,
Alice said, her voice on the edge of deathly quiet. I know, Eloise said, and more was communicated in the silence that Kristen didn't quite understand. I'm glad you like him, Kelly said. You deserve someone to take care of you. Alice looked at Kelly with some surprise in her eyes.
Thank you, Kelly.
Let's eat, Eloise said.
No news for you?
Alice asked. She shook her head, and Kristen was glad she wouldn't have to share anything either. She hadn't taken any steps to find somewhere else to live, but her situation wasn't quite as pressing as Kelly's. The conversation lightened, and Jean stopped in to ask, Did you bring Parker, Kelly? Kelly quickly swallowed her bite of pancake. No, she said. Sorry, Jean. My mother's boyfriend took him to a movie. It's okay. Jean flashed her a smile. You're still bringing him tomorrow, though, right? Kristen looked at the hope on her daughter-in-law's face, and then back to Kelly, who was nodding. Yes, he'll be here at 11. Jean smiled then and continued up the steps. A new silence settled over the group, and Kelly cut another bite of her pancake before she looked up and noticed everyone watching her. Jean has a special love for Parker, Kelly said. I bring him all the time. Kristen barely held back a new flood of tears. Thank you, Kelly, she said. It obviously means a lot to her. Alice nodded, but Eloise had moved her eyes back to the doorway, and she stood up. Robin, she said. Kristen slowly put her fork down, almost afraid to hope that AJ would be behind her.
Am I too late?
Robin asked, taking a step into the room. Her eyes were guarded, and Kristen couldn't tell how she was feeling.
Our meeting at the credit union ran long because they wanted to pull our credit and get the loan pre-approval started before the holidays.
She dropped her bag at her feet, her countenance falling slightly.
I'm exhausted, and there better be bacon left. There's tons,
Alice said, scooting her chair over to make room for Robin.
Tell us what happened at the credit union.
Robin sat down and pulled 2 pancakes onto her plate before reaching for a few slices of bacon.
We're going to get a loan for the new boat. The interest rates are at 0 because of the tsunami, and Margie said we'll get approved easily.
She took a bite of bacon.
It's not free, but honestly, I don't think the money from Diane is either.
No one spoke for a few seconds, and finally Eloise said, "Truer words have never been spoken." "Let's call AJ," Kelly said, pulling her phone from her back pocket, "like we used to when she lived in New York."
She won't answer,
Alice said. "If she wanted to be here, she'd be here," Eloise added. "I'll put her on video," Kelly said, as if the others hadn't spoken.
She might answer if it's Kelly, Robin said. Be sure she knows we're all here, too. I don't want her to be even more upset.
"She's not upset," Kelly said. "At least not at us. She's working through a lot of feelings and emotions right now, and most of her anger is aimed at her mother or herself." "Just tell her we love her and we'd love to share our news with her," Kristen said, glancing at Eloise. "I'll have to come up with something, I guess." Eloise smiled and reached for Kristen's hand. "I will too, if that's what it takes to get AJ on the line." Kelly's phone rang and rang, and they all waited to see if AJ would answer the video call. Or not. Chapter 28.
AJ accepted the scrambled eggs her dad had whipped up and put on a plate for her.
"Thanks, Dad." She met his eye, and they seemed to say so much more. "Sorry to just show up out of nowhere." "You're always welcome to show up here out of nowhere," he said. And AJ was glad she'd found him sober this morning. Amy had told her last night that their father barely drank anymore, but AJ hadn't believed her until they'd stood on the front porch and he'd opened the door without bloodshot eyes. He'd already been dressed, too, though it had barely been 9 o'clock, and he'd hugged Darcy and Mary. He'd told them to go down to the beach and see if they'd gotten any lobsters overnight, and then he'd offered to make breakfast. Amy bustled around the house like she'd been there many times before, because of course she had. AJ had gazed around at the pictures on the walls, which showed her, Ryan, and Amy at various stages of their lives. The furniture was new, or at least stuff AJ hadn't seen before. The flooring had been removed and new items brought in. When she'd asked if he'd done that since the tsunami, he'd said no. He did it last year when the carpet had needed to be replaced. The appliances were clean. The fridge only had bottled water, a half-gallon of milk, and a pitcher of juice inside. He'd told her about the way he'd stripped the cabinets and restained them. And he'd taken her into the backyard, which was a terraced set of wide steps that led down to the beach. Each one bore something her father detailed for her, and AJ had been marveling at everything for over an hour, including the steaming breakfast in front of her right now. He'd added cream to the eggs, and plenty of salt and pepper, and while AJ sometimes had a poor reaction to her first meal of the day, she ate the eggs eagerly and asked for more. Amy paused in her story about Donovan and his attempt to get donuts this morning. Apparently, the line had been 2 blocks long, and Amy had been musing about making her own for Christmas Eve morning. She hadn't asked AJ if she'd still be with them tomorrow morning, and AJ herself didn't know if she would be or not. She'd originally planned to spend it with Matt, just the 2 of them waking up in his bed whenever they felt like it. They'd make something for breakfast and sip coffee together, and AJ hoped he'd make love to her at some point as well. She'd told Amy all about Matt, and when they'd reconnected, their long-distance relationship, and the future she hoped to have with him. It had been easy, too, because Amy genuinely didn't judge AJ. Somehow, getting herself to tell her father about Matt and the unborn child inside her was much harder, and AJ felt the clock ticking. "What are you doing for Christmas?" her dad asked as he got up to reheat the pan still on the stove. AJ exchanged a glance with Amy. "I don't know, Dad. What are you doing?" "Oh, I get up and tend to the shrubs," he said. "Amy said I could come watch the girls open their gifts. She'll feed us." He looked over his shoulder on his way to the fridge. "Are you staying with her?" "I did last night," AJ hedged. "I've been staying with my boyfriend." She cleared her throat. "Do you remember Matthew Hymas?" Dad straightened, the carton of eggs in his hand. His eyes were lighter than AJ's and the source of her more fair coloring. "He was the one you went with in high school, right?" "Right," AJ said, although she'd never gone steady with Matt, or even out on a proper date. AJ didn't date anyone. She'd never had a steady boyfriend until after college. "I'm seeing him," AJ said. "He lives on Diamond Island, and he's running the golf course. The Hymases own the golf course." "Oh, Yancey's son." "Yes," AJ said with a smile as Dad turned his back on the table and started cracking eggs into a bowl. AJ looked at Amy again, and her sister inclined her head as if to say, "Get on with it." "Matt and I are probably going to get married," AJ said, "before the baby comes next year." Dad spun around, his face arranged into an unreadable expression. "What?" "I'm pregnant," AJ said with a smile. She refused to be unhappy about the life inside her. She already loved her baby, and she really wanted her father to love it too. "The baby is Matt's, and he's asked me to marry him." Dad closed the distance between them, and AJ stood to hug him. "Congratulations, Ava." AJ's eyes burned with tears. "Thanks, Dad." "Why probably marry him?" Dad asked. "He asked her," Amy said. "She hasn't said yes yet." She spoke in a teasing tone because she wasn't sure why AJ hadn't jumped at the chance to become Mrs. Matthew Hymas. In her words from last night, Amy had said, "You've been in love with him forever." "Why not?" Dad asked. "He asked just before the tsunami hit," AJ said. "It's been a little chaotic since then." Dad nodded and turned back to the stove. The cold eggs hissed as they touched the hot pan, and the scent of scrambled eggs filled the kitchen for the second time that morning. "Could Matt and I come watch the girls open their presents?" AJ asked, meeting her sister's eyes. "Of course," Amy said. "He can stay with you tonight if you'd like." AJ nodded, but she didn't immediately reach to text Matt. "Dad," she said, "when's the last time you saw or talked to Mom?" Dad spun around again, this time his face a horrible combination of surprise and resignation at the same time. "A long time." "How long?" Amy asked. Dad looked from her and back to AJ. "At least 20 years, maybe a little longer. Why?" He turned and removed the pan from the burner. "She's in the cove," AJ said, deciding to go right for the jugular. "She works for a charitable organization called White Sands Worldwide, and she's offered all this money to me and my friends to help with the damage from the tsunami." Dad brought the pan of eggs to the table and clunked it down in front of AJ. "She's here right now?" "I saw her yesterday," AJ said. "First time in 35 years for me." Dad sat heavily at the table. "I'm so sorry, sweetie." He hung his head. "What happened?" AJ reached to scoop herself some eggs and said, "Amy, I can't tell it again." Amy opened her mouth and told the story. AJ interjected every so often to get a specific detail right, and soon enough the story was out. "I don't know what my friends will do," AJ said, thinking of the text she'd received last night and even this morning. She hadn't found the strength to respond, and she knew that a non-response said plenty. "I thought I could drink your mother away," Dad said. "I thought I could find someone else to dull the pain." He kept his eyes down, and AJ's memories of the amount he'd drank, and then all the women he'd brought home while she was still living in the house, streamed through her mind. "None of that worked," he said. "What's worked is me taking control of my life, working through my thoughts and feelings, and replacing the negativity with positivity." He looked at AJ now, his eyes blazing and strong. "Amy started to do some of that, and I know you have too." "I've been trying," AJ said. "I have a very long way to go." "Then go the distance," Dad said. "I thought I'd need to confront Diane at some point, but I haven't needed that. Maybe you do." AJ looked at Amy, who sat at the table with her arms folded. She wore a dark look in her eyes, and AJ wondered if they did need to sit down with their mother and hash everything out. Perhaps there was a dam there that needed to be broken before complete healing could happen. AJ nodded and started eating her second serving of eggs. When she finished, she thanked her father and added, "Dad, I'm really sorry I disappeared. I didn't know any other way, and I had to go. I had to do something to preserve the little sanity I had. And I'm afraid that hurt you." She wiped at her wet eyes. "That wasn't my intent." "I know that, sweetie." He drew her into a hug, and it was so nice to be held by a parent. AJ hadn't had that in quite a long time, and she clung to her father as forgiveness cleansed her from the inside out. "We've all made mistakes," Dad said. "I apologize for being a drunk and leaving you to raise Amy and take care of yourself. I shouldn't have brought home all those women. I never taught you to respect yourself or the value of intimacy." "Dad," Amy said, "you did the best you could." He stepped back from AJ, his eyes broadcasting pure pain. "I know I did, but it wasn't good enough. I know that too. Oh, I wish I could change the past, but I can't. All I can do is build the future."
"Grandpa!"
Darcy burst through the back door.
"2 lobsters!"
"Wow," Dad said, his expression changing in the blink of an eye. "Looks like we're going to be eating like kings on Christmas Eve."
Mary giggled. "Christmas Eve."
AJ picked up her plate and started to turn toward the sink when her phone rang. A number sat there that she didn't have programmed into her phone, and she hesitated. She often had calls out to leads and agents, and not all of them were in her phone. She ignored the call, exchanged a glance with Amy, and went to put her plate in the dishwasher. She'd barely finished that when her phone chimed. She collected it from the table to see Matt's name at the top. "Your mother just called me to get your number. I gave it to her, AJ. I'm not sure if that was a mistake or not, and if so, I apologize." As she reread his text and all the dots connected in her head, another message from Matt came in. "Can you call me when you get a minute? I hope your visit with your father is going well. I love you, and I love your heart, and I love your strength." She smiled and pressed her phone to her bosom. She loved him too. And while she may not have been in love with him forever, she certainly was now. While she held her phone against her chest, it rang again, and the screen showed the same number from a few minutes ago. She turned it toward Amy, who was watching their father interact with the girls as they talked about the seafood feast they'd make that night. "It's Mom," she said, barely loud enough for her sister to hear a few feet away. Somehow her father heard too, and Dad turned toward them, his eyes wide. "I'm going to answer it," AJ said. "Do you want to talk to her too?" "Put it on speaker," Amy said, and AJ swiped on the call so it wouldn't go to voicemail. "Hello?" She left the kitchen and went to sit on the front porch. Amy followed her, and sure enough, AJ recognized the smooth, crisp voice of her mother as she said, "Hello, Ava Jane." "You're on speaker with me and Amy," AJ said, tapping to put the call on the speaker so her sister could hear too. She sat on the top step on the front porch and put the phone on her knee. "What do you want, Diane?" "I was hoping to take you to lunch before I go back to Halifax," Diane said. "Hello, Amelia." "Hello, Mother," Amy said, and she gave her more respect than AJ had simply by not using her first name.
We just ate breakfast with Dad. I'm not sure we're ready for lunch.
AJ was surprised at the level of passive-aggressive bite in her sister's tone. I understand,
Diane said. Right, AJ said with a scoff. I'm sure you're so well-versed with how a young daughter feels when her mother disappears while she's at school. That's such a good point, Amy said. Did your mother abandon you when you were 8 years old, Mother? Diane didn't answer, and AJ knew the answer would be no. Their maternal grandmother had been a big help in the first few years after Diane had left, and her death had really pushed Dad into booze and bimbos. AJ met Amy's eyes, and Amy rolled hers. I think, AJ started, I'd be willing to go to lunch if you're going to apologize and attempt to explain. I don't care what her explanations are, Amy snapped, and it was nice to see her lose her cool a little bit. AJ didn't want to feel like the irrational, unhinged sister all the time. I don't either, AJ said. To me, there's no possible excuse for what she's done. I still feel like I need to hear it. I need to know why she felt like she needed to leave. Amy's gaze glittered dangerously, but she nodded. I might not be able to attend. I can go alone, AJ said, feeling the strength inside her that Matt had spoken of. She'd had wells of strength in the past. They'd allowed her to go back out onto the field when she was injured. They allowed her to let any boy into her bed. They allowed her to carry a baby at age 45. Is the saltwater surf okay? Diane asked. Say an hour? I'm out on Pearl, AJ said. I don't know if the ferries are running at full capacity yet. They're not, Diane said. We'll be partnering with Mr. Bridge to get them back up and running as normal by the new year. She sounded so proud about it, too, and AJ and Amy rolled their eyes at the same time. For some reason, AJ wasn't angry today. She was simply more resigned, and she did want to unstop the things holding her back so she could take a step forward. Let's say 90 minutes, she said, barely holding back her laughter as Amy started to giggle. That will be fine, Diane said in a cool, nearly aloof voice. See you then, Ava Jane. Diane? She asked. I'm not coming if you can't use the name I'd like you to. Diane Proctor, in her current state, probably wasn't used to anyone speaking to her like that. Several seconds passed before she said, Very well, AJ. See you soon. Good to hear your voice, Amelia. I'm sure, Amy said sarcastically. AJ jabbed at the phone icon to hang up because her laughter was going to burst from her. The phone had barely beeped when she and Amy dissolved into giggles. Up and running by the new year, Amy said in a mocking tone. They laughed even harder, and several dark corners that had been lurking in AJ's soul got swept clean by simply laughing with her sister. AJ arrived at the saltwater surf before the 90-minute deadline. She sat in the rideshare and watched the clock tick past 11 and watched the meter cross the $15 mark. Okay, she finally said. Thanks for waiting. I'm ready now. She touched her smartwatch to the sensor in the back, paid her fare, and got out of the car. The Saltwater Surf was an upscale, slightly unknown seafood bar off the northern coast of Diamond Island. It sat on private property, within a posh 5-star resort. AJ made her way inside, having met many athletes and clients inside the wealthiest of hotels, clubs, and restaurants. She held her head high as she glanced around, her purse balanced perfectly on her forearm the way all the rich and famous women did. Her mother rose from a chair several feet from her, and AJ's footsteps slowed. Perhaps this was a bad idea. Perhaps she should have listened to her sister. Time had a strange way of separating into individual threads as it slowed. AJ breathed in, and she could see her mother standing in the doorway, her dirty blonde hair up in a ponytail. She'd waved goodbye to Amy and Ava Jane that morning, an apron over her clothes and a smile on her face. As she breathed out, they walked to the ferry station the way they did 1,000 other times. They went to school. They came home, and Ava had argued with Amy about whether or not she could come with her to soccer practice that afternoon. Another breath in showed her that afternoon in the park. Amy had come with her.
because their mother wasn't home and Dad hadn't come in off the boat yet. The breath out had the years flying by in fast motion, each one filled with empty afternoons, and Ava Jane transforming into AJ, the star soccer player. Then AJ, the girl who slept with everyone. Then AJ, the woman who couldn't make the Olympic team, who grew resentful of her coaches, who dropped out of college only to go back later to get that degree. She took a step toward her mother, realizing that she'd done a lot of stupid things after her mother had left. She'd also done a lot of amazing things, too. "Hello," she said, and all the individual strands of her life merged back into one. "AJ," Diane said, "thank you for coming." AJ made a show of looking at her phone. The breakfast at the lighthouse had started 35 minutes ago, and she wanted to be there instead of here with all the power of the sun. "I need to be back on the ferry by noon," she said. Diane frowned and adjusted her own purse. "I don't see how that's enough time," she said. "The saltwater surf doesn't serve a fast lunch." "Let's just see how it goes then," AJ said. "I might be able to buy myself a little more time." She had no idea how long her friends would be at the lighthouse, and a voice in the back of her mind whispered that if she texted just a few words, they'd show up in this insufferable restaurant and rescue her. No questions asked. "Very well." Diane turned and led the way toward the restaurant's entrance. "You'll be happy to know that only William Bridge accepted our offer." AJ's eyebrows shot up. "Is that right?" She drew level to her mother, and when she turned to the right to look at her, it was almost like looking in a mirror. The shiny hair without a strand out of place. The perfectly make-upped eyes, the slim figure. She must be so tired, was all AJ could think. She was, and she could admit that one of the biggest reasons she'd transitioned to freelance work was so she didn't have to check each of the 5,000 pieces of her life to make sure they all laid flat, behaved, and came together to present the perfect version of herself. No one was perfect, and she was tired of trying to look like she was. "Not even Robin?" AJ asked as her mother held up 2 fingers for the hostess. She leaned toward the other woman and said, "Under Sasha Summers." The woman's eyes widened, and she signaled for someone to come over. "Yes, Miss Summers, your private booth is prepared." "Why do you use a fake name?" AJ asked. Diane fixed her with a hard gaze, and AJ had certainly seen her mother angry before. Once, she and her brother had wandered down the street to an elderly woman's house where they'd eaten strawberry pies and played with her little dog. Diane had been livid because she hadn't been able to find them. When they'd finally gone home, Diane had looked at them with this level of danger in her gaze. It had quickly softened into concern and worry, and then tears. And AJ couldn't fathom then that her mother would leave her and her siblings behind only 4 years later. She said nothing as a sharp-dressed man led them past all the tables and booths in the regular part of the restaurant. Down a hall they went, and he indicated a doorway to the right. Diane said, "Thank you, Sean," as she stepped inside, but AJ hesitated. It almost felt like she was committing herself to the dark deep if she went through that arched doorway and into the private booth. She did it anyway, because she'd been in some pretty dark places in her life, and she'd always managed to claw her way back to the light. The room held a single booth that could easily seat 6, and AJ slid onto the side opposite of Diane. "You can brighten the room with the window and skylight," Sean said in a smooth tone. "Your waiter is Rich, ma'am, as requested." "Thank you," Diane said again, and Sean left. AJ didn't have time to ask her how often she'd been here before Rich stepped into the space. "Good morning, Sasha," he said easily, a smile on his full lips. His eyes darted to AJ and back to her mother. "Do you require a wine menu?" "We're not drinking this morning," Diane said, deciding for AJ, not that she'd have had alcohol. "Could you bring juice and water?" "Of course," Rich said, bowing. "I'll have a mango lemonade," AJ said as he stepped back. He looked at her again, almost like he hadn't been expecting her to speak. "Yes, ma'am,"
he said quickly and left. What is going on? AJ asked. How often do you come here? If her mother had been coming to the cove all this time, AJ wasn't sure what she would do. I don't come here, Diane said. I own this restaurant and I requested certain people to see how they do. AJ didn't believe a single word she said, but she didn't know how far to push her mom either. Mm-hmm, she said. He knew you usually drank wine. Do you drink it with him? She glanced toward the doorway. Is there a secret room to sleep with him when you're drunk? Ava Jane, her mother said sharply. Stop it. You don't get to tell me what to do. AJ said. This was a mistake. Amy was right. She slid to the end of the booth. Sorry, Diane. Sasha, whoever you are, I shouldn't have agreed to this. She stood and took a moment to reach back for her purse. I go by Sasha Summers, her mother said, because then I don't have to think about what I did when I was Diane Proctor. AJ turned toward her and found the most vulnerable, pathetic look on Diane's face. I couldn't do it, Diane said. Have that name hurled at me every day, reminding me of where I should be. AJ's heart pounded very loudly in her ears, and she couldn't get her feet to move. She couldn't get her mouth to form another question either, though several ran through her mind. She sat back down, right on the edge of the long bench seat, and stared at Diane. Long moments passed, and Rich returned with a tray of juice, water, and AJ's mango lemonade. He put no less than 8 glasses on the table and lifted the tray again. Coffee or tea, ma'am? No, Diane said in a quiet voice. Will you please bring us the continental breakfast basket? The 12-piece or the 15? He shot a glance at AJ. 15, Diane said. I'd also like the sea salt sampler with the bacon. Yes, ma'am, he said. AJ had eaten at the saltwater surf before, and she'd never heard of those things. They hadn't even been given menus. Diane looked at her again. I know what you want to know. Why did you leave? AJ asked. Diane didn't sigh, and she didn't make a single move to fix her hair. She blinked at AJ, but not rapidly. I left because I am weak and I am a coward. I left because I wasn't strong enough to stay and fight for the things I wanted. Confusion ran through AJ. I don't understand. I left because I'd cheated on your father and I was pregnant with someone else's baby. A small smile crossed her face, almost like she didn't know she'd made the gesture. He promised me everything, Ava Jane, and I believed him. Silence hung over them until AJ said, So you left us for him and this other baby? At first, she said. She stared straight at AJ. I lost the baby, and I lost him. I'd already lost your dad and you kids, and I was too weak to return, apologize, and try to start again. AJ had not expected her mother to admit to any faults, weaknesses, or misdeeds that would paint her in a bad light. Did Dad know? Yes. Where have you been all this time? Halifax. You obviously have a lot of money. I found someone else with deep pockets and a heart of gold. He doesn't know I'm here. And he doesn't know I have 3 children. You don't have 3 children, AJ said, something roaring up inside her. She felt fire in her eyes, and she hoped her mother could too. You're right, of course, Diane said. AJ didn't know where to look, but she didn't want to look at her mom anymore. She wasn't sure this was fixing anything for either one of them. I'm sorry, Diane said. I know it's not enough, and I know you have no reason to forgive me. I do hope you'll try to accept my apology and my weaknesses. I'm going to tell my husband about you, Ryan, and Amelia when I return home, and I'd like to start seeing all 3 of you again. AJ's shock knew no end, and she could only stare at her mom. Her phone rang, a special blingy type of chime that said whoever was calling wanted her to engage in a video call.
Her mind couldn't wrap around the sound, and she held very still. Rich arrived with a basket as long as AJ's arm and placed it on the table. Muffins and bagels of all varieties had been nestled among the wicker, and a tray of jams, butters, and marmalades went beside it. "The sea salt sampler is 3 minutes out," he said. No one spoke to him, and he left the booth. AJ's phone rang again, and this time her mind knew what to do about it. "It's Kelly," she said. "I have to answer." She tapped on the video icon and gave the device a moment to connect. "Hey, Cal. You're on with all of us," Kelly said, her voice happy. AJ looked at her phone to find Kelly holding it out from a table where Robin, Alice, Eloise, and Kristen sat. They'd all crammed together to be in the frame, and AJ's heart took courage. "Where are you?" Kelly asked. "It's kind of dark there. We can barely see you." "I'm at the saltwater surf," AJ said, and in the next moment, light flooded the booth. She looked over to her mother, who had opened the blinds on the window and the skylight with the press of a button. "I'm with my mom." Kelly sucked in a breath, and someone said, "Oh my goodness." "Do I need to take you off speaker?" Kelly asked, pure worry in her eyes. "No," AJ said slowly. "We want you here," Robin said. "At the very least, you have to come to dinner at the inn tonight. Everyone is going to be there, and it's our last event before Christmas." AJ hadn't forgotten about the dinner, and she said as much. "None of us are going to take the money," Eloise said. "Even Robin." "I got a loan at the credit union," Robin said. "I could never do that to you, AJ." "We love you, AJ," Alice said, and AJ smiled at all of them. They'd called her like this when she lived in New York, too, and as they continued to talk, she realized that they had become her family. She'd missed out on having a mother, but had she? She'd had Kristen Shields. She'd had her sports teams and her seafaring girls' friends, and out of everyone, they had not abandoned her, even when she'd abandoned them. Tears pricked her eyes, as they'd been doing a lot lately. Finally, she held up her hand and said, Guys, how long will you be at the lighthouse?" "How fast can you get here?" Kristen asked. "The ferry from Sanctuary is 18 minutes, Eloise said. "I bet we can see her in half an hour if we meet her at the station." "Jean has a car," Kristen said. "I'll see if we can borrow it." They kept talking, making plans to be at the station to get her in just 30 minutes. AJ let one tear slide down her face, and she said, "Kelly, I'll text you when I'm getting on the ferry." "Okay," Kelly said. "Remember, the dinner is for everyone." With that, the call ended, and AJ stared at her phone for a second. Then she lifted her eyes to her mother's and said, "It's our final night together before we go back to our own houses and lives. It's kind of a big deal, and everyone is invited. I'm going to be there with Matt, and would you like to come?"
Chapter 29. Alice couldn't believe what new level of stress she'd managed to find. Preparing dinner for dozens of people used to be something that thrilled her. Dressing up and painting her face weren't chores. Impressing others was something Alice could do in her sleep. Tonight, though, she'd already worn one dress backward, only to have her daughter point it out to her right when the water for the pasta boiled over. She'd tossed the tongs to Ginny and raced out of the kitchen to fix her dress. In the end, she'd changed completely because she couldn't be confident in a dress she hadn't even known how to wear when Will showed up. He'd arrived 5 minutes ago, and their eyes had met across the dining room as she'd set a basket of rolls on the buffet table. The lobby and dining area buzzed with merriment, and Alice loved the energy at parties. At least that hadn't changed.
"Is there anything I can do to help?"
She turned at the soft yet powerful voice to find Will only a few feet from her. He held a glass of club soda in his hand, and with that beard and that long hair, he was easily the sexiest man Alice had laid eyes on in quite some time. "Yes," she said with a smile. "We need that serving platter with the 4 spots from the hot bar out front. These sauces are ready." She and Kristen had put together a pasta bar for their last night together. They'd chosen 3 different shapes of pasta and prepared 4 different sauces. Alice could boil noodles, and that was about the extent of her culinary knowledge. Kristen had made a meat sauce, a slow-cooked marinara, a bacon carbonara, and an Alfredo. All 4 pots bubbled on the stove, and she gave Alice a look as Will nodded and turned to leave the kitchen. Alice sighed and wiped one hand across her forehead.
"He's handsome,"
Kristen said. "I'm so nervous around him," Alice said. "It makes no sense. I knew him as a kid."
"Maybe that's why,"
Kristen said.
"Did you know him like AJ knew Matt?"
"Heavens, no," Alice said, though she'd be lying if she hadn't already thought about sleeping with Will. She'd been so lonely for so long, even when she'd been married to Frank. That was her reasoning, at least. "I used to sneak over to his cabin while we were at camp together. We kissed a little, and that's it." Charlie entered the kitchen, and Alice spun away from the doorway she'd been watching.
"Mom, one of Don's cats got up on the table and spilled the bread."
He plunked the basket next to her. Alice blinked, not quite sure what to do.
"There's another bag of rolls right there,"
Kristen said.
"Start slicing, you two."
"Right." Alice reached for a knife and handed it to Charlie. She thought she might slice off one of her fingers if she tried to cut the rolls. Her brain had taken a vacation, and it was currently playing second to her hormones. She hated that, and she didn't know how to get back in control of herself. She had sudden new respect for her son, and she smiled at him as he began slicing the rolls.
"What?"
he asked, giving her a wary look. "Ginny said she wasn't going to go out with Cameron," Alice said. "I thought you'd like to know." His eyes rounded, and he smiled.
"That's great, Mom. Really great."
"Don't say anything to her," Alice said. "The last thing I need is her knowing I'm sharing her secrets."
"Whose secrets?"
Will asked, setting the 4-well serving dish on the stainless steel workstation next to Charlie. He beamed at the teenager, but Charlie didn't even look at him. Alice said, "Say hello to Will, Charlie."
"Hello, Will,"
Charlie said in a monotone. He looked up, the knife still moving.
"How are you, sir?" "Good,"
Will said with that big smile still in place.
"When is your daughter coming home from Hawaii?"
he asked. Will's face fell, and he cut a look at Alice. Alarms started to ring, and she nearly hipped her son out of the way and told him to go make himself useful somewhere else. She stopped herself just in time, and she hated the grinding in Will's throat.
"Sorry,"
Charlie said, also glancing at Alice.
"Never mind. I'll finish these out there."
He tossed the knife in the basket and took the whole thing toward the door. "I apologize," Alice said. "I don't think he meant to bring up anything sensitive." She knew Charlie didn't like Tori, Will's daughter, and his question had maybe carried a little sarcastic bite. Alice had barely noticed, though, so perhaps Will hadn't either.
"Tori has decided to stay in Hawaii with Sandy,"
Will said.
"I got off the phone with her an hour ago, and I'm afraid I haven't quite processed it."
"Can she do that?" Alice asked, her lawyer instincts perking right up. "Don't you have full custody?"
"Yes,"
he said.
"Tori's a handful, to say the least. She's headstrong like her mother and a dreamer like me, and that's kind of a dangerous combination."
"She still can't break a custody agreement," Alice said.
"I won't fight her on it."
Will looked like he wanted to shrug, but he didn't. He gazed evenly at Alice.
I just want her to be happy."
He was a pushover, just like Charlie and Ginny had suspected he was. They'd said Tori got whatever she wanted, and Alice could see it clearly. Still, it might solve one of her problems, because if Tori wasn't around, surely the twins wouldn't have a problem with Alice dating Will.
"What are you thinking?"
Will asked.
"She's thinking she better help me get this buffet set up so we can eat,"
Kristen said.
"We're supposed to start in 5 minutes."
She gave Alice a friendly smile and nudged her out of the way.
"Grab a ladle, dear, and a pot. It's not hard."
She began to ladle the meat sauce into one of the wells. Alice turned away from Will, still trying to define her thoughts. Thankful for the distraction, she handed Will a ladle and set the pot of marinara in front of him. and together the three of them got everything in the right place and back out onto the hot buffet.
"This is amazing,"
Eloise said, coming to stand beside Alice as she gazed at the hot bar. "This is a great investment," Alice said, reaching out to touch the buffet. "Will you do a lot with it?"
"I'm going to steal this pasta bar idea,"
Eloise said, smiling at Alice. Alice returned the gesture and gave Eloise a side hug, too. "Thanks for having us all here, Al,"
"I'm sorry you don't have the big house to host us in anymore,"
Eloise said, and Alice was touched by her kindness. No one had acknowledged that Alice might be having a hard time selling the house on Rocky Ridge. Alice was supposed to be stoic and sure of herself all the time. Alice barely had feelings. None of that was true, and she said, "Thank you, Eloise. I am going to miss that house."
"All right,"
Kristen said in a loud voice. Alice turned around and stood at her side.
"We're ready. Everyone gather over here."
Alice looked around at everyone there, and while they'd started at the lighthouse only 8 months ago with just the 6 of them, their familial group had expanded by quite a bit. With the kids there, they still had 7 extra humans, and when AJ's baby came, that would make 8. She stood next to Matt, and surprisingly, her mother. Alice's smile slipped as she met Sasha Summers' eyes. She wasn't normally so distrusting, but Alice had already seen Kelly get hurt by a family member, and she didn't want AJ to suffer any more at the hand of Diane Proctor. AJ had filled them all in that afternoon while they relaxed on the top deck of the lighthouse, watching the wind whip the water into white-crested peaks as the waves drove toward shore. She'd invited her mother, and everyone was allowed to bring who they wanted to the final dinner. Alice had her children and Will with her, and Robin's whole family had come. Billy had ridden the ferry alone successfully, and she stood next to Eloise, her father, and Grace. She was a gorgeous girl, and Alice's smile hitched back into place when she looked at their little family. Kelly stood with AJ and Matt, Parker way over by Jamie and Duke on the other side of the room. Reuben and his wife Jean stood with Parker too, and Alice was glad the boy had more people who loved him. Alice and Kristen stood at the front, and once everyone had settled down, Kristen said,
"Welcome to our holiday pasta bar. Alice managed to find pasta in the shape of snowflakes, snowman bow ties, and Christmas trees."
She smiled at Alice, who knew the next part of the speech. "Kristen made all of the sauces from scratch," she said. "Charlie cut the rolls, and Ginny made a couple of loaves of garlic bread."
"Santa's elves also came a little early,"
Kristen said, grinning out at everyone.
"They left behind some reindeer cookies, and there's plenty for everyone to have as much as they want."
That was the end of the script. But Alice really wanted to say something else. "Thank you for being here, everyone." Her throat closed slightly, but she was used to powering through emotion. "I'm so glad everyone is spending Christmas in the Cove this year, and I hope we can make it some sort of annual tradition." Kristen put her arm around Alice, and the two women looked at one another. Friendship and sisterhood flowed between them, and Alice loved her seafaring girls' leader so much.
"All right,"
Kristen said.
"Chief Sherman is going to say grace, and then we'll eat."
A couple of hours later, Alice needed to get out of the heat of the inn. They'd had such an amazing time, with the scent of oregano and tomatoes hanging in the air. She'd eaten far too much chocolate in the form of reindeer cookies, and she'd basked in the candlelight, warmth, and Christmas spirit. Now, though, she slipped her arms into the sleeves of her coat and stepped out onto the front porch. She quickly zipped up her coat and flipped up the hood. The December night held magic in the sky, and Alice looked up at the stars, wondering if she'd ever believed in wishing on them. Alice hadn't been a whimsical child, and her father had taught her the stars could show her the way home. She'd loved them for that reason alone. And as her breath steamed in front of her, Alice closed her eyes and felt the peace and stillness of the universe around her.
"Mind if I join you?"
Will stepped next to her, and Alice gave him a smile. I just needed a few minutes of silence, she said.
Your friends are great.
Will pocketed his hands, which cocked his elbows out slightly. Alice tucked her arm through the crook of his arm and said, "Do you want to walk with me?"
How far are we going?
He asked. Not far. She glanced down the road, the moonlight shining on it and making it look like silver. Just to the rise there and back. She looked at him. Sound good?
I left my hat inside,
He said.
If I don't freeze my ears off, I'll be good.
He smiled again, drawing Alice's attention to his straight white teeth and oh, that mouth. She tore her eyes from his lips and focused on going down the steps without falling. Once her feet were on solid, flat ground, she relaxed a little bit.
Did things get dried out at your place?
Will asked. Enough, yes, Alice said. The new house she'd bought on Diamond Island had suffered some damage. She was covering the cost of the windows in her place, and the sellers of the house she was almost about to own had arranged to have the mold treatments done, bring in the big industrial fans, and get the first level of the house back to normal. It helped that the cellar is literally cove reconstruction.
That is insanely lucky,
Will said. His place hadn't suffered any damage, as he lived on the highest point in the cove. How are the ferries coming along?
Quickly,
He said.
They're sending a fleet of mechanics tomorrow, if you can believe that.
He continued to talk about the ways White Sands Worldwide was helping him get the ferry system back to fully operational. And Alice sure did like the sound of his voice. They arrived at the rise in the road, and Alice didn't want to take another step. If she did, she'd be going down, and she didn't want to climb back up. It's a beautiful night, she said. Do you ever ride the ferry at night?
Sometimes it's dark when I first go to work in the morning,
He said.
Otherwise, no. In fact, it's past my bedtime right now.
He chuckled softly, the sound almost echoing around inside Alice's head. She felt so comfortable with him, like she had nothing to hide. She could be herself, and that person didn't have to be perfect. So you're a morning person?
Yes,
He said.
What about you?
I feel like I'm a morning person and a night owl, she said. When I was younger, I used to love to ride the ferry at night, or just be on a boat when the air was the same color as the sea. There's something exciting about it. I can hear the water. I know it's there, slapping against the side of the boat, but I can't see it. She shivered. It's like this little thrill. He turned his head and looked at her, and Alice met his gaze.
You're an amazing woman, Alice,
He murmured. Her gaze dropped to his mouth, and Alice's mind blanked.
I want to kiss you.
He whispered.
Too soon?
She turned her whole body toward him and reached out to run her fingers down the side of his face. Are you going to miss your daughter?
Yes.
He whispered. I can't imagine letting either of my children go live with their father full time, she said. I'd miss them so much.
They're nice kids,
Will said, turning to look out over the whole of Sanctuary Island again.
I've liked getting to know them a little bit tonight.
Thank you. Alice gripped his arm with both of her hands, still pressing her body into his side. I don't think it's too early for a kiss, she whispered. Will's smile lit up his profile, and when he turned toward her, the moonlight illuminated the fear in his eyes. What is it? She asked, her own desire firing out of control.
I haven't kissed a woman in a long time,
He admitted. You haven't dated?
A little bit,
He said.
here and there. Miss Andy and I split up 7 years ago, and nothing's been terribly serious since.
Is kissing serious business? Alice teased. I think we used to do it all the time, and it wasn't too terribly serious.
Maybe for you,
He said, the last word catching in his throat. Alice's eyes widened as shock and humiliation ran through her. What does that mean?
It means I was serious about us, even way back then. You were the one who thought it was just something fun to do during summer camp.
She searched his face for any hint of a lie, but she couldn't find one. Will,
It's okay.
I'm sorry, she said anyway. I I didn't know. It had been exciting to sneak from the girls' half of the summer camp to the boys'. Alice had gotten a thrill just by stealing through the darkness of night, rapping on Will's door and pulling him outside by the lapels on his collar and kissing him.
Like I said, it's fine.
You never asked me out, she said, or even to a dance,
I can't dance.
he said.
I didn't take anyone to high school dances.
His tone suggested all high school dances were ridiculous, and Alice thought she better keep him away from Charlie. You could have taken me to dinner and a movie, she said, still trying to process what he'd said.
This version of myself can see that.
He said.
30 years ago, I could not.
He gave her a wry smile, and Alice reached up to put her palm on his cheek, keeping his attention on her. I liked you back then, Billy, she said with a smile. And I like you now, too. She leaned further into him, her heartbeat booming through her chest. It's been a while since I kissed a man.
Really?
He asked.
But you just got divorced this summer.
Alice's mouth suddenly felt sticky. My ex-husband cheated on me a lot, she said, the words just flowing from her. I didn't let him touch me for about the last, 3 or 4 years of our marriage. Her insides burned because of that, and she desperately wanted to kiss Will and see if the things she'd been feeling had any merit at all.
Alice, I'm so sorry,
Will said.
My wife didn't cheat on me. She just didn't want to be with me anymore. She fell out of love with me, whatever that means.
Alice knew what it felt like to fall out of love with someone. It means she'd had enough, Alice said.
Enough of what?
I don't know. Whatever it was that she thought she could handle forever. Turns out she couldn't. For me, it was the cheating. I thought I could handle it. I knew Frank slept with whoever he could find in the city. I knew he had serious girlfriends. I thought I could handle him only coming home on weekends because we had a lot of money. Big houses and fancy cars. 2 perfect children, and I was the PTA president, on the HOA board, the whole 9 yards. All of those things had been so important to her once. Now she counted herself lucky she didn't have to attend meetings where they literally discussed if Mrs. Webb could have 8 rose bushes in her yard when she clearly could only take care of 7.
I can see that about you,
Will said with a smile.
You're smart and ambitious. I like that.
You like smart and ambitious? She asked.
You sound so surprised.
He looked at her openly, a measure of vulnerability in his eyes that spoke to Alice's soul. I mean, a little, she said. After our summer together, you started going with Eden Brooks, and she was gorgeous. I thought you liked her more than me because of that. Will gaped at her.
Alice, I didn't like her at all.
What? Alice asked. Yes, you did. You guys held hands and you snuck off with her during every football game that fall. Will looked at her, his eyes crinkling in the corners as he smiled.
You were watching me.
She nudged his shoulder. Stop flattering yourself. She couldn't help thinking how different her life would have been had she dated Billy Bridge her senior year. Would she have married him? Would she have left for college and never come back? She'd had some pretty lofty goals back then, and she'd achieved every one of them. Will chuckled, and Alice pressed further into him. He'd asked to kiss her, but he wasn't taking any of the hints. Will, she said, are you going to kiss me? A strangled sound came out of his mouth. You asked, and I've been using body language to say yes for the past 5 minutes. She grinned at him, pleased when he returned the gesture.
When I snuck off with Eden,
He said,
the only way I could get myself to kiss her was if I imagined it was you.
With that, he took her fully into his arms, leaned down and kissed her. Alice's blood turned to lava in her veins, and she pushed her hands through his hair, her eagerness to be close to him explosive and almost embarrassing. He slowed her kiss, but Alice wanted to go fast. She was burning up from the inside out, and she liked kissing him. He moved slower than he had as a teenager, and he knew exactly where to put his hands now. He pulled away and said,
"No instructions from you this time. I'm impressed with myself."
He grinned as widely as the sea and kissed her again. Alice couldn't get her brain to work, so she simply wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back. Chapter 30. Robin handed Duke a cup of coffee, and he grinned up at her as she stepped over his legs and feet and curled into the couch. "All right, Mandy," she said. "Go ahead." She lifted her own mug to her lips and sipped. The feeling of contentment spreading through her couldn't be described. No, she hadn't heard from the loan officer at the credit union, and she wouldn't for another couple of days as tomorrow was Christmas Day. No, Duke wouldn't be out on the water until after the New Year. He would likely drive Robin crazy before her wedding in only 4 days, but she was going to put him to work to help her with that event. After that, she had a long list of things he could do around the house to keep him out of her hair. She barely recognized herself inside such calm thoughts. "Okay," Mandy said. "This one's for Alice." She got up and handed a small package to Alice. Robin smiled at her best friend, glad she and the twins had agreed to come spend Christmas Eve at Robin's. Kristen had joined them too, because she was going to stay with Robin until she found somewhere to live. Kelly was on Belle Island with her family, and AJ had taken Matt to Pearl to spend the holidays at her sister's house. Eloise and Aaron were at the inn, and Eloise's texts that afternoon had been full of all-cap messages and scads of exclamation points. The first check-in of the new Cliffside Inn had gone really well, and Robin almost teared up again just thinking about it. "How did you know I'd even be here?" Alice asked, looking at Robin. "It's just something I pulled out of my cupboard," Robin said. "Low expectations, Alice." Alice grinned and untied the blue bow on top of the package. The lid came off easily after that, and she lifted out a bag of buttermints shaped like lobsters. She started to laugh, her fingers already working to untwist the tie holding the mints captive. "I love these!" She plucked out a blue lobster and put it in her mouth. She handed the bag to Will, who sat next to her, but he declined.
"I don't like those."
"You're kidding," Alice said, looking at him with wide eyes. "Oh, this might be a deal breaker," Robin joked, grinning at the two of them. Alice had been especially tight-lipped about her budding relationship with Will, but Robin wasn't blind. She was a mother of 2 teenage girls, and she knew Alice had done something with Will. His daughter was out of town, and while he had family in the Cove, he'd opted to come here tonight for a couple of hours just to spend some time with Alice. Her kids didn't seem super happy about it, but they were minding their manners. Charlie sat on the hearth alone, close to the tree and Mandy, his eyes watching her as she picked up another gift. She handed it to Charlie, who looked at it.
"Duke."
He got up and handed the present to him.
"Thanks,"
Duke said, smiling at Charlie. Mandy and Charlie didn't spend a ton of time together around Duke, but he hadn't made anything too awkward yet. He ripped through the paper and unwrapped a boxed brownie mix.
"Yes,"
he said, laughing.
"Can you make this tonight, baby?"
He handed the box to Robin, who shook her head. "No." She pushed the box back at him. "Ask Mandy."
"Not it,"
Mandy said.
"Come on,"
Duke said.
"It's my Christmas Eve gift."
"Maybe you should make it, Dad," Jamie said, and everyone paused to look at her. She said so little that when she did, Robin listened.
"Maybe you should,"
he quipped, picking up a pillow from the floor and tossing it toward his youngest daughter. She caught it and laughed, and Robin grinned at everyone in the room. The scent of the pine-scented candle filled the air, but the oyster stew was quickly taking over. There was nothing better than the scent of butter, milk, and seafood, and Robin got up to go check on the stew on the stovetop. She'd toast the rolls and brush them with garlic butter once they finished their Christmas Eve gift opening. "This one's for Jamie," Mandy said as Robin lifted the lid, and Jamie opened a pair of pajamas. Mandy, Charlie, and Ginny did as well, and Mandy gave a box to Will next.
"I can't believe there's one for me,"
he said, looking at Robin. "You obviously don't remember Robin very well," Alice said. She can cover any base, usually in a moment's notice. Again, Robin said. Low expectations.
It's heavy.
Will's voice carried surprise, and he glanced at Alice. When he opened the package, he lifted out a box of monster drinks. Charlie said you like those, Robin said.
I do,
Will said, grinning.
This is breakfast for the next week.
Gross, Alice said, while Charlie said,
See, Mom? I told you those monster drinks were appropriate for breakfast.
No, Alice said, shooting her son a dark look. Not for 15-year-olds. She slid a look of disgust toward Will. I'm not so sure it's appropriate for you, even.
It's orange-flavored,
he said.
It's practically a fruit.
I guarantee there's not a single ounce of fruit juice in that thing. She reached for it, but Will lifted the cans away from her before she got close.
2%, he said. Want to bet?
I'm not betting you, Alice said with a grin. You guys are grossing me out, Ginny said, getting up. Can you stop flirting for like 10 seconds? She threw Alice a disgruntled look and settled onto the beanbag with Jamie. Sorry, Alice murmured, her eyes focused on the tree. Will studied the cans of energy drinks.
2%,
he murmured, and Robin caught Alice give him a small smile. That just leaves you, Mom, Mandy said, getting up and handing Robin the gift. Thanks, sweetie. Robin didn't know what was in the package. She'd told Duke the first year they were married that she wanted to have a holiday tradition where they opened one gift on Christmas Eve, and his job was to make sure she had one. When the girls had come along, Robin took care of them. She took care of anyone who came to the house, including her mother, siblings, and this year, Alice and her family, Kristen and Will. Wait, Robin said. What about Kristen? She opened hers, Mandy said, settling onto the hearth and taking Charlie's hand in hers. I missed it, Robin said, leaning forward to see Kristen. She held up the bag of Snickers.
I'm like a ninja. You've already opened those,
Duke said with a chuckle.
I'm starving.
Kristen smiled at Duke.
I won't ruin my appetite, Duke. Don't worry.
With that, she unwrapped another mini candy bar and popped it into her mouth. Jamie snickered, and so did Ginny, and Robin took the opportunity to start opening her gift. Treats and soda pop were the easiest gifts to give for this Christmas Eve tradition, and the girls always got pajamas. Today, though, Robin peeled back the final layer of paper and saw a long jewelry box. Duke, she said, the name mostly made of disbelief. They couldn't afford jewelry, especially right now. She didn't dare open the box, and she lifted her eyes to her husband's. We can't.
I bought this months ago,
he said with a soft smile and those sparkling, dark eyes.
Open it, baby.
Robin looked at the dark velvet and cracked the lid. A string of pearls sat there, and she sucked in a breath. Oh,
they're from the oysters I've collected this year,
he said.
I took them to Mark, and he made the necklace for me.
Robin heard all the time that had gone into this string, and she fell in love with her husband all over again. They're wonderful.
They're not all perfect,
he said, reaching for the string. It wasn't long enough to be a necklace, but it would circle her wrist easily.
And they're not all the same size. They're from the wild, and Mark polished them and arranged them the best he could.
I love them, she said, her voice slightly pinched.
I love you, Robin,
he said.
Our life isn't perfect either, and sometimes we're not very shiny, and we're not all in the same place at the same time.
He unclasped the bracelet, and she held out her arm.
But our family belongs together.
He secured the bracelet and smiled at it, then her. We do belong together, Robin whispered, tilting her head back to kiss him. Thank you, baby. Are they being gross? Alice asked, and Robin broke her kiss with Duke and tucked herself into his chest instead. It's different, Mom, Ginny said. They're married. That was really sweet, Mandy said, smiling at Duke and Robin. So it's only gross because it's me, Alice said.
Yes,
Charlie said.
You haven't flirted in a while, Mom. You should let me and Ginny give you some pointers.
Alice looked back and forth between her son and daughter, and Robin laughed at the confused look on her face. Time to eat, she said, getting up. I flirt just fine, Alice said, but all 4 teens in the room started shaking their heads. Alice folded her arms and frowned. Robin gestured to her. Come help me, Alice. I'm even more useless in the kitchen, Alice grumbled. But it'll be better than being told I can't flirt. Robin had a hard time stifling her laughter, but she'd been consciously trying to get along better with Alice, so she only said, Put that butter in the microwave. Alice did, and with both of them turned away from the group in the living room, Robin whispered, You're doing fine with Will, by the way. He doesn't have a problem with your flirting, and that's all that matters. Alice closed the microwave and said, 1 minute? Yep. Their eyes met, and Alice nodded. You're right. I don't want to flirt like a 15-year-old. I'm 45 years old. Robin grinned at her and handed her a mini whisk. Did you kiss him last night? Alice's grin said it all. And if it hadn't, the long, wistful sigh certainly did. Robin giggled and said, When are you seeing him again? Like a formal date? Yes, without the twins. Robin turned on the broiler to toast up the rolls. Grab that garlic powder and put a healthy amount in the butter. She mimed whisking. Mix it up. Mix it up, she repeated. And we're going out Friday. There's a silent auction he wants to go to. Fancy, Robin said with a grin. Can't wait to hear about it. She slid the rolls in the oven and set the timer for 2 minutes. 5 minutes later, she called, Dinner, everyone! Come eat! Chapter 31. AJ woke on Christmas morning with a perfect sense of calmness in her soul. Beside her, Matt breathed in softly, comforting her further. She didn't want to get up and disturb the peace, so she rolled over and slid her hand across Matt's stomach. His breathing changed, and he moved to wrap her in an embrace. Morning, Ava Jane, he whispered. His lips touched her forehead, and AJ kept her eyes closed as she basked in this good man's love. I love you, Matt, she whispered. He tensed, but AJ didn't move at all. I want to marry you, she said. You mentioned it a few days ago, and we haven't talked about it again. No, we haven't. He ran his hand up and down her arm slowly. I love you too, my beautiful Ava Jane. You tell me when you want to get married, and I'll be there. I want us to plan something together, she said. It's not just for me. I've been married before, he said, as if she didn't know. I want the wedding to be whatever you want. I want to get married before the baby comes. Okay. AJ pulled away and looked into his eyes. I want to wear a white, flowing gown and get married on the beach. Matt smiled at her, and he was so handsome in the softness of morning. AJ loved this time of day, because the heaviness of life hadn't descended onto her shoulders yet. Her mind woke clear, and she felt like her authentic self first thing in the morning. What will I wear? He asked, leaning his head closer to touch his lips to her cheek. You'll wear a pair of loose white pants, too, she said, seeing the perfect wedding in her mind, and a light blue shirt, open at the throat. No shoes. Neither of us will wear shoes. Sounds nice, he said, kissing her neck now. So maybe May. AJ pressed into his touch, enjoying his kiss in a whole new way. A less frantic way of making love. One where she wasn't trying to escape, but to be present with the man she loved. As he made love to her, AJ stayed right there in the moment, enjoying every kiss, every touch, and every breath she took with Matt. As she lay in his arms later, she asked, Are you ready to meet my dad? I did okay with Amy, he whispered, his lips right at her ear. Didn't I? You did great with Amy, she said, but you knew her from before. I don't think my father knows you used to sneak into my bedroom when we were in high school. She smiled at the memories, because she now recognized the feelings Matt had always awakened inside her.
He'd been telling her for decades that she was good enough just as she was, and she'd been too numb to hear him. We're not going to tell him that. Matt chuckled and rolled away from AJ. We better get up and get going. The girls won't be patient. Just then, AJ heard squealing, and she slid to the edge of the bed, too. She dressed quickly, and she and Matt went downstairs to the living room, where Amy and Donovan had their tree set up. Mary danced around the tree, her eyes wide and filled with childlike wonder.
Look, Aunt AJ, there's this huge present with my name on it.
She tiptoed over to the big green and white package AJ had put in the corner. You're kidding, she said. How in the world did Santa get that in here? You don't even have a fireplace. Mary looked at her with pure joy in her face.
I don't know. Mom! Mama, come look.
She's coming, Darcy said as she entered the living room from the hallway that led into the master suite.
She said to put some coffee on, and Daddy wants toast. I can do the toast, Mary said, skipping into the kitchen.
AJ smiled at them, and Matt slid his hand along her waist. She leaned into him and said, I don't want to exclude myself from my family anymore. You won't have to, he said. My parents would love to see us today, but if we don't make it, we don't make it. We'll make it, AJ said. I want to be part of your family, too. What about my kids? Matt asked. Do you want to meet them? A tremor of fear ran through AJ. She'd almost forgotten that Matt had 3 other children with his previous wife. Of course, she said. Whenever you want me to meet them. I need to tell them about us, he said. I haven't done that yet, AJ. I know. I was afraid they'd think it was too soon. It's definitely too soon to be out of bed, Amy complained as she entered the living room. Her hair looked like she'd rubbed a balloon on her head, and AJ grinned at her. She wore a pair of sweatpants and a bathrobe over that, and she looked so suburban housewife that AJ couldn't help laughing. Too loud, Amy complained. It's already after 7, AJ said, thinking of her morning and all she'd done already. We went to bed at 10:30. Lucky you, Amy grumbled on her way into the kitchen. Thank you, Darce. You're my favorite 8-year-old. She dropped a kiss on her daughter's head. Why were you up so late? AJ asked, following her sister into the kitchen. The coffee had just started to drip, but AJ didn't want coffee anyway. She got out the electric kettle and asked Mary, We get to have hot chocolate on Christmas morning, right?
Yeah.
AJ grinned at her, noting that her sister hadn't said what had kept her awake. Her husband came into the kitchen, and he was barely dressed. He wrapped his arms around Amy and growled, which caused her to shrink into his chest and giggle. AJ stared at the two of them, not because she didn't want to see them acting like they were in love, but simply because she'd never seen Amy act like this with a man. Even at Amy's wedding, she and Donovan had been very proper. Ho, ho, ho! Someone called from the front door, and Mary shrieked, Grandpa! She ran down the hall toward the door, and AJ had a brief, out-of-body moment. Grandpa. Her father would be the grandfather to her child, and she suddenly couldn't wait to see him in that role. Darcy followed her sister, and Dad came into the living room with both girls in his arms a few seconds later. AJ hardly recognized him, though the eyes were the same. He was simply different, too. Morning, girls, he said, and AJ got thrown back in time. Before he'd started drinking heavily, he'd come into AJ and Amy's room and say those 2 words to them. She'd appreciated that, because it made a completely abnormal situation normal again. Merry Christmas, Dad, AJ said, stepping over to hug him. He put down Darcy and Mary and took AJ into his embrace. How are you, AJ? Good, she said, taking a deep breath of his cologne, which hadn't changed in 40 years. I'm so sorry, Dad. It's okay, he said. You don't need to keep apologizing. We're just going to move forward. He stepped back and smiled at her. Okay? Okay. AJ smiled and ducked her head. I want you to meet Matt. We're going to be married in May or June. Matt touched her back and AJ glanced at him. Matt, this is my father, Wayne Proctor. Dad, this is Matt Hymas, my fiancé and the father of my baby. Dad smiled at Matt and extended his hand.
Nice to meet you, Matt. You too, sir. Oh, no.
Dad shook his head.
I'm not a sir. He's really not,
Donovan said, handing Dad a cup of coffee.
Come on, everyone. Mary's about to stage a riot if she can't open that big present.
He smiled at his youngest, who stood right on the edge of the circle of presents. He went to join her, and Dad did too. Matt started to follow, and when AJ didn't, he turned back. You go, she said. Save me a spot. I'm going to make some hot chocolate. Amy still loitered in the kitchen too, nibbling on a piece of toast as she surveyed the situation in the family room. Thank you for having me and Matt, she said. Of course, Amy said. You're always welcome here. Just not late at night, she whispered so no one would overhear her. You know, you should try waking up early to make love to your husband. Then you won't be so cranky in the morning. Amy's eyes widened, but AJ knew exactly why she hadn't gone to bed at 10:30 when they'd all retired. AJ grinned and poured the now boiling water into a mug. She added the powdered hot chocolate mix and stirred it all into a delicious drink. I'm just saying, you're rested and you're off to a really great start to the day. She left her sister standing at the island and went to sit next to Matt as Mary ripped into the big green and white package. Chapter 32. Eloise glanced at her phone, knowing she was already late. She'd had a hard time getting out of the inn that morning because she'd been conducting interviews for a live-in manager. She found herself enjoying the chats with those who'd applied, and she'd fallen behind in her schedule. She'd texted the group, so they knew she was still coming to lunch, but she wasn't surprised to find the table full when she finally got to the restaurant. I'm so sorry, she said, taking the last spot between Kristen and Laurel. She glanced around at everyone. Look at all of us here at a Wednesday lunch. Pure happiness filled her, especially when Kelly pushed a tall glass toward her. We got you the virgin strawberry daiquiri. Thank you. Eloise reached for a straw and unwrapped it. Should we do something like a good news minute? Good news minute? Alice asked. Yeah, remember they used to do those our senior year? They'd highlight all the good things that had happened the previous week. 60 seconds. Eloise stuck her straw in her drink. We could do that. 60 seconds each, only good news. I feel like this is a new tradition, Robin said. New Year's Eve lunch. Only good news can be discussed. I'm down, Alice said. Me too, AJ added. I'll go first, Kelly said. The twin home is amazing. It's so clean, and Parker and I had a great Christmas with my mom and Devin. She smiled around at everyone. I'd love to have a dinner there with everyone at some point. Nothing big or special. Pizza and bagged salad. I will take pizza and bagged salad any day of the week, AJ said with a grin. Kelly laughed, and Eloise noted how happy she was now. She'd been through a lot in the past 8 months, and she seemed more like the Kelly Eloise had grown up with. I wish I could come to the Wednesday lunch every week, she said. But some of us have to work, so I'm thinking we should do a Sunday dinner or something where we can all attend. Several people nodded, Eloise included. One more thing, Kelly said. I hope my time isn't up. She looked at Eloise, who said, You have 10 seconds, as if she'd been timing her. She giggled, and Kelly grinned at her. I filed for divorce yesterday. She took a deep breath and blew it out. I'm in control of my life for maybe the first time. A beat of silence covered the table. Then Robin said, Good for you, Cal. Proud of you, AJ said. Let me know if I can help, Eloise said, in any way. She meant it, too, because she'd do anything for these women. Anything at all. Okay, my turn, AJ said. Matt and I are planning a late May or early June beach wedding. She beamed like she'd swallowed a ray of sunshine. That's it. Good news second. She laughed, and Eloise joined her. That's it? Kelly asked. What about your Christmas with your family? Yes, that was a lot of fun, too, AJ said. It's been really great to include myself with them again. They've been so accommodating and accepting. She actually looked like she might cry, and Eloise didn't know how to make the two halves of AJ line up. She was more emotional and hormonal now that she was pregnant, and Eloise was still adjusting to her new personality.
And your mother?
Robin asked.
That's to be determined, AJ said. She came to the party, and it was awkward. She says she wants to be in my life, but I honestly don't know if that'll happen. Maybe if I reach out to her. But you know what? I don't want to. I want her to reach out to me. If she does, I'll accept it. If she doesn't, I think I'm in a place where I can accept that too.
Wow, Kristen said. That's quite different from what I saw in the pavilion a week ago.
Yes, a lot has changed in a week, AJ said. I've changed a lot in the past 3 weeks. You're still you, Robin said. Just a more fabulous version.
She grinned at AJ, who smiled back.
Yes, AJ said. A more fabulous version.
She sipped her soda.
I'm done. I'll go, Alice said. Will and I are getting along really great. That's it? Robin asked, giving Alice a side glance as they sat directly beside one another.
Eloise felt a brief flash of being left out of the trio she normally fit inside so well. She had to remind herself that she'd created and lived a life of her own with Aaron and the girls, and she couldn't expect to be inside everything.
We've kissed a few times, Alice said, grinning. It's all new and exciting, and he's definitely my boyfriend.
Wow, straight to the labels, AJ said. Look at you, Alice.
Right?
Alice laughed too, and Eloise couldn't help feeling like she barely recognized her friend. She was so different from the waif of a woman who'd come for Joel Shield's funeral, and the complete opposite of the woman who'd brought her children to Rocky Ridge after filing for divorce. She weighed more, and she laughed quicker. She seemed alive, and Eloise hadn't even realized she wasn't before.
Robin,
Kristen prompted.
Duke and I got approved for the loan for the boat, Robin said, grinning. My mother returned home safely from her cruise, and the wedding went off without a hitch on Sunday.
She picked up her soda pop glass and raised it slightly.
To a great holiday season.
Eloise shook her head because she didn't want to toast to a holiday season that had started with a tsunami. She rolled her eyes at Laurel, but they both raised their glasses anyway. Eloise took a long drink of her fruity concoction, and she loved the tart sweetness of strawberries and lime. I talked to Billy about sex, Eloise said, and I think I did a pretty good job, too. Another beat of silence.
Wow,
Robin said, her eyebrows high.
I thought you were going to say something about the inn.
The inn is amazing, Eloise said. I'm having so much fun with it. I was late because I'm doing interviews today for my live-in manager. I've got some great candidates. And while I'd like to keep the apartment for myself, I'm going to be moving in with Aaron, and it's just not feasible for me to keep the apartment just because I like it. Almost everyone nodded as she spoke, and Eloise was glad they agreed with her. Sometimes she just needed confirmation from people she trusted, and she grinned around at her friends.
How's your mom?
Kelly asked. She's healing up nicely, Eloise said. She hasn't had any problems with the insurance either, so she's going to be back to new in no time.
That's great, Eloise,
Laurel said, and Eloise smiled at her, so glad she was there. Your turn, Laurel.
Oh, I don't have anything,
she said.
You don't have anything good that's happened?
AJ asked.
Everyone has something good, don't they?
You're still dating Paul?
Robin said.
Yes,
Laurel said with a duck of her head, a brand new kind of smile forming on her face.
Oh, look at her,
Alice said, clearly teasing Laurel.
That smile is very revealing,
Kristen said.
It is not,
Laurel said, and she straightened her mouth with relative ease as she lifted her eyes back to the group.
My house is almost all the way fixed, too, and I'll be back there by the weekend.
Where have you been staying?
Robin asked.
It better not be a hotel. I have plenty of rooms if you need a bed.
Laurel took a long drink of her lemon water. Eloise needed to be more like her, someone who drank water and ate salads. She probably ran, too, and lifted weights, the same way Aaron did. Sometimes Eloise still experienced a bit of doubt and jealousy when it came to Laurel, but she knew she didn't have anything to worry about.
I know that look, AJ said, grinning. She's been staying with Paul, of course.
Nothing's happened, Laurel said quickly. I'm sure he's frustrated with me, but I just need a little more time before I can do that. The women silenced again, and Eloise reached over and covered Laurel's hand with hers. You've never really said what happened. It's good news, Minute, Kelly said. This doesn't seem like a happy story, and Laurel, you don't have to tell any of us anything you're uncomfortable with.
Yes, she does,
Alice said, shooting a glance at Kelly.
That's literally what we do. We force each other to say things that are uncomfortable, and then we work to fix them.
She looked at Laurel.
She's been around us enough now. She'll have to decide if she wants to stay in our group or if she wants to find other friends who don't want to help her. Okay, Alice,
Robin said.
I'm just saying, we tell each other things that are hard so we don't feel all alone.
She looked around at everyone.
We choose what to share and when, but everything comes out eventually.
Laurel looked around at everyone, and the restaurant seemed to hold its breath.
I really like all of you, she said, and I don't have many people I'm very close to. I'm a little closed off, though. It's going to take some time for me to open up.
One uncomfortable thing,
Alice pressed, causing Kelly and Eloise to shoot her daggered looks.
What?
She asked.
You guys grew up with Robin, and she made us admit to so much. I'm just giving her a break as the pushy one of the group.
Thanks so much, Alice,
Robin said dryly.
You're so welcome.
Alice grinned at her, and the two of them laughed together. I was in a very abusive relationship, Laurel said. He forced me to marry him, and he forced himself on me several times. I really like Paul a lot. So much. I like kissing him, and I have very real feelings for him. I know he wants more, and I'm getting there. You take the time you need, Eloise said.
Yes,
Alice agreed.
And now I feel like a jerk for making you talk. I'm sorry, Laurel.
She looked at Robin.
How do you do this? It's terrible.
That caused the whole table to burst out laughing, even Laurel. She was definitely quieter than most of the other women, but she reminded Eloise of herself at a younger age, and she felt oddly protective of the woman. Kristen obviously did too, because she leaned past Eloise and said, You come eat cookies with me any time, Laurel. I won't make you tell me anything unless you want to. Laurel nodded, her smile beautiful and lighting up her whole face. Thanks, Kristen. She met Eloise's eye, and understanding and compassion streamed between them. You're always welcome at errands, too, Eloise said almost under her breath. Okay, Laurel? I hope I didn't make things so awkward that you can't go to him for help. You didn't, Eloise, Laurel assured her. Besides, it was him who made things awkward. You're so right. Eloise grinned at Laurel. Who's next?
Just Kristen,
Alice said, and everyone looked at her. Kristen gazed around at everyone. When Joel died, I thought I'd be so lonely. I thought I'd be alone, and everyone would forget about me. Eloise sobered, her heart going out to the woman who'd literally made her teenage years bearable. But you girls have been exactly who I thought you were. I'm so lucky that you're mine, and that I get to be in your lives. Alice touched her hand to her heart and reached across the table to squeeze Kristen's fingers.
We love you, Kristen.
I love all of you. She drew in a breath. I'm staying with Robin and Duke right now, but I'm going to look at a house on Saturday, and if it's decent at all, I'll have my own place again soon. I hope it's decent, Kelly said. Me too, AJ said. And Kristen, I know you miss Joel, but if he hadn't died, we wouldn't be here right now. I would have never come back to the Cove. Eloise didn't think she would have either. She certainly wouldn't have been on that stretch of beach where Aaron had been running with his dog. Her whole life had been steered down an entirely new path when Robin had called and said Eloise needed to come to the Cove for Joel's funeral. Others agreed, but Eloise just listened to them all talk. With the good news minute over, regular conversations started to resume.
Wait,
AJ said.
wait a second, guys.
Everyone quieted down, and Eloise knew what AJ was going to say.
We need to gather every year for the holidays. I want a firm confirmation of that.
She looked around at everyone. When no one jumped to commit to such a thing, AJ asked, "Robin?"
Yes,
Robin said.
I'm in for that. I liked what we did this year, a little gathering before Christmas Eve so we can still do our own individual family traditions.
"I'll pay for the inn," Kristen said. 4 nights, 3 days, just before Christmas. "Kristen," Eloise said, "you don't need to do that."
No, you don't,
Alice said.
we can all chip in.
"I own the inn," Eloise said. "No one needs to pay for it."
It's 4 nights, you can't book your rooms.
Robin said.
Of course we'll pay for it.
"So it's settled then," AJ said with authority. "Every year, for the few days before Christmas Eve, we'll meet at the inn for Christmas in the Cove." "Yes," they all said together, and Eloise watched as a smile spread across each of their faces, none bigger than AJ's.
All right, a waitress said. Here's the fried calamari and oysters.
She set a couple of platters of food on the table, and it was like none of them had eaten for days. The noise level increased with the food, and Eloise thoroughly enjoyed herself at this New Year's Eve lunch, and she had high hopes for the next 12 months that lay in front of all of them. Chapter 1. Kelly Thompson looked at the house she'd owned for decades now, her heartbeat giving her an extra thump she didn't quite understand. She'd been coming here for a few months, and she'd brought Parker several times. "Thanks, Rich," she said to the rideshare driver. "Could you help me with the boxes in the back?"
"Of course,"
Rich said, grinning at her over the console.
"When are you going to move in, Miss Kelly?"
The older gentleman with rich, dark skin had a quick smile every time he saw Kelly. She'd gotten into his SUV many times for a ride from the ferry to this house, and they'd become friends over the past few months. "Soon," Kelly said, reaching to unbuckle her seatbelt. Getting items for the house from Diamond to Belle Island wasn't easy, and she'd left Parker with Gene Shields today to get some things done. The springtime ocean breeze met her as she got out of the car, and Kelly took a moment to breathe in the scent of flowers mixed with sea salt. She loved springtime in the Cove, and it felt like it was coming early this year, as it wasn't even April yet. The sky held a shade of blue rarely seen by the human eye, and Kelly looked up into it and felt the magnificence of life pressing down on her. Gratitude for the life she now lived streamed through her, because a year ago, she hadn't even known how unhappy she was. She'd been through some trials in the past 12 months, that was for sure, and her mind flashed past Zach Watkins, Tiffany Mueller, her ex-husband, Julian, hard work in a moldy, greasy kitchen at the Cliffside Inn, a tsunami, getting up at 5:30 to go to work every day, and losing everything she owned to water damage. She'd also attended a court hearing to finalize her divorce, learned to let go of her tight grip on her son, and spent a lot of time with her mother and her boyfriend.
"Just in the garage, Miss Kelly?"
Rich asked, and Kelly snapped out of her memories. She had plenty of others, and in fact, this house was stuffed full of them. She wanted to make even more here with her son. And she once again had the thought that she had more to do before she could move into this house. And it wasn't moving in several small appliances, new bedding, and a box of cleaning supplies. That all needed to be done too, of course, and she shivered as the breeze turned into a wind. She stepped to the back of the SUV and picked up the new coffee maker, stacked a toaster on top of it, and then grabbed the basket where she'd put all the linens, as well as the new kitchen utensils. She was stocking the house one purchase at a time, using some money from every paycheck. The house had hardly any furniture, but those were bigger purchases Kelly hadn't been able to afford yet. She'd been saving a little bit from every check as well, and she had 4 big items on her list before she and Parker could move into this house on Seabreeze shore. 2 beds, one for her and Parker, a couch, a dining room table and chairs.
If she could somehow get those pieces, she could envision herself living in this house. "Right there is fine," she said to Rich, and he set down the blender and the laundry basket filled with new sheets and pillows. "Thank you so much, Rich,"
You're welcome, Miss Kelly.
he said.
You text me when you're ready to go back. I'll come get you.
"Yes, sir." She put down her boxed appliances, too, and stepped into him to give him a hug. "You say hello to Miss Everly for me, okay?"
Oh, that reminds me.
He stepped away and snapped his fingers.
She sent a buttermilk pie for you.
"She did?" Kelly turned as Rich hustled back to the SUV. "How did she know you'd see me today?"
It's a weekend.
he said as he opened the passenger door and bent inside the vehicle.
I've had the pie since yesterday, but it'll still be good.
He lifted it from the glove box, and Kelly gaped at the personal-sized pie. He grinned as he handed it to her, and Kelly felt more love from him and his wife, a woman she had never met, than she had from anyone but her best friends. "Thank you." Her voice choked slightly, and Rich held her tightly.
She loves to bake.
He said, stepping back.
So you're doing something good for her.
"I hope she feels better quickly," Kelly said, as Everly seemed to have a multitude of health problems Rich had told Kelly about over the months.
I'll tell her you said so.
Rich said.
I best be going. Lots of people coming to Bell today.
"Yes, go." Kelly smiled at him as he got behind the wheel, and she stood in the carport until he left. She started hauling in the appliances and things she'd brought to the house that day, and nothing gave her greater joy than unpacking things she'd worked hard to afford. She put them in cabinets and closets that made sense to her, and Kelly enjoyed the progress she'd made over the weeks. The kitchen sat clean and ready for her to use. She'd bought curtains and hung them on the windows, one over the sink and a huge one that overlooked the small backyard. The old table and chairs sat pushed into the corner, and Kelly needed to get rid of them. She wasn't paying for any services here yet, though, so she couldn't just put it on the curb and have the garbage truck haul it away. The pantry held bottled water, fruit snacks for Parker, the popcorn she and AJ shared when they came to the house for their private chats, and a box of protein shakes. Kelly needed to start thinking about stocking the house with more to eat, as well as all the home goods people needed to live. Toilet paper, paper towels, washcloths, oven mitts. The list went on and on. Kelly had lost everything in the tsunami that had hit Five Island Cove just before Christmas, and she'd been renting a fully furnished twin home on Pearl Island since then. Everything she'd been able to replace, she'd brought here, like her own silverware, a few dishes, and now the linens and kitchen utensils. All in all, she wanted to be ready to move into this house by summertime, but she still wasn't sure she'd make it. She worked as a teacher's assistant at the junior high on Diamond Island, and she managed to pay her bills with that income. There wasn't much left over, and Julian had been sending her money for Parker before the divorce was final, and now that it was, she was receiving alimony too. The money she got from her ex-husband paid for all of Parker's school expenses, their groceries every month, and as she unboxed the toaster, she realized he'd paid for that too. "You're getting closer," she said to herself. After putting away all of the items she'd bought that weekend, she wandered from the back of the house to the front, where a large room spanned the width of the building. The front door sat squarely in the middle of the room, and a large staircase went up to the second floor directly across from the entrance. The hall beside the stairs led to the kitchen and dining room, which took up the back of the house. Her father had kept an office in the space to the right of the front door, and the family had enjoyed their movie nights and family meetings in the room to the left. All the bedrooms were upstairs, including the master suite, and Kelly turned to go that way. She'd shared a bedroom with her younger sister, Heather, while her older one, Sabrina, had always had her own room. Once Sabrina had graduated and left the Cove, Kelly and Heather had their own rooms. She'd always had to share a bathroom, and her parents were the type that didn't keep their bedroom door open.
Kelly still hesitated before going into the master suite, as she was never allowed in there as a child. She wasn't sure why. She'd started Parker's life with him in a bassinet right beside her in the master suite she and Julian had shared once upon a time. When he couldn't sleep, she brought him into their bedroom. The door was hardly ever closed or locked, and Parker came into her bedroom at will, even now. Memories of the house flooded Kelly's mind as she stood in the large room that had once housed her mother and father's bed. She could see the hulking, dark wood dresser that had sat next to the door, and the lacy, cream-colored curtains her mom had put over the bay window that looked over the backyard. Kelly went to the window and looked out. The view of the yard, the cliffs, and the ocean beyond, the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She did love the cove, though she'd always been afraid of the water. She wasn't as much anymore, but a hint of trepidation still stole through her from time to time when she thought about swimming in the ocean or getting on a boat. She had to ride a ferry to work every weekday, and she'd had to do the same as a child and teenager growing up. Somehow, a ferry wasn't the same as any other boat, and especially if she stayed inside, she didn't worry about sinking. Her parents had forced her to join the seafaring girls, and Kelly hadn't been happy about it. She was now, though, and she thought about the women she loved so dearly. "You need to tell them all about this house," she said to her partial reflection in the glass. Only AJ knew she owned this house, and Kelly wasn't sure why she wanted to keep it a secret. "You need to tell your mother." She wasn't sure how her mom would take the news that Kelly had bought this house and had owned it all of these years. Her mother hadn't wanted it, not after everything that had happened here. The walls started to whisper, little hisses of sound in Kelly's ears. She turned quickly and left the master bedroom, skipped going into the one she'd once used, and hurried downstairs instead. She burst out the front door, as she'd done many times before, one instance of when she had fresh in her mind. When her father had lost the glassworks, it had felt like everything in Kelly's life stopped making sense. That was the beginning of the end for her family as she'd previously known it, and she remembered keenly listening to her parents argue in loud voices that only increased in volume. She remembered the feeling of unrest, the worry which writhed way down deep in her soul, and the fear that if her family fell apart, she'd crumble too. She remembered jumping to her feet and leaving Heather and Sabrina huddled together in the hallway outside their parents' bedroom and racing down those steps. 2 long strides, and she reached the door. A twist, a pull, and she burst onto the front porch. She stood there now, letting the fear and doubt and worry wash through her. Accepting how she felt was the only way she'd been able to rid herself of it. If she didn't allow herself to feel the feelings, they built up to dangerous amounts, infecting her thoughts and influencing her actions. She didn't want to live like that anymore. She wasn't afraid of what might happen anymore. She'd learned that she could take a situation and work through it. She could think, and she was smart enough to come up with solutions. She could help others because she wasn't drowning the way she'd once been. She drew in a deep breath and found her center. "You're okay," she said out loud. She had no idea how to start a conversation with her mom about this house, and she hoped all the progress they'd made over the past year wouldn't be undone when Kelly finally confessed she owned the house on Seabreeze shore. Her friends could help her, and she took out her phone to send a few texts. Number 1, she needed to get this Wednesday off of work. Her friends met for lunch every Wednesday. Kelly could never go, and she tried not to let it bother her. In her quiet moments, though, it definitely bothered her that everyone had a job that allowed them the freedom and flexibility to lunch together every week. Kelly didn't have that luxury, and her ideas of starting a yoga studio in the right part of the house where her father had once kept his office entered her mind again. That would have to wait, though, as she needed money for furniture, food, and the necessities of life before she could even think about starting her own business. A business that may fail. Kelly was still mighty afraid of failing. Failing herself, her son, her friends. Her principal said, "I'll call Miriam, and if she can come in on Wednesday, you can have it off." "Thanks," Kelly typed out. Before she got confirmation from her boss, Kelly sent a message to the group string that housed Alice, Robin, AJ, Eloise, Kristen, and Laurel. "I have something to tell everyone on Wednesday for lunch. Will everyone be there?" They'd talked about getting together for Sunday dinners, but it had only happened a couple of times. Alice and Robin loved to entertain, and without them, the dinners probably wouldn't have happened at all. Messages started to pour in, and before another 60 seconds had passed, everyone had confirmed that they'd be there on Wednesday, even Laurel. Kelly's lungs tightened, but she pushed through the pressure on her chest. This was okay. She could tell her friends about the house, and when she asked for their help with how to break the news to her mother, they'd all have solutions and suggestions she hadn't thought of. That honestly wouldn't be that hard, because every time Kelly thought about telling her mother about this house, she pushed the idea away. She didn't even entertain it, and keeping the house on Seabreeze Shore a secret was second nature to her now. She took another breath and released the tight grip her fingers had on the railing. She looked down at her fingers as the tension released, a plan coming together. Kelly loved plans, and once she had one, she could execute it. Her friends would help her come up with a plan to tell her mother about this house. "Kelly?" She looked up from where she'd been staring at the porch railing, her pulse pounding at the familiar voice. Her mother stood just on the other side of the white picket fence separating the front lawn from the street, pure confusion on her face. "What are you doing here?"
This has been Christmas at the Cove, Women's Fiction with Heart. Five Island Cove, Book 4. Written by Jessie Newton, narrated by Jill Smith. Copyright 2020 by Elena Johnson. Production copyright 2021.